December 3rd, 1967, Ashland, Nebraska. Police officer Herb Schirmer was on his night patrol around 2:30 a.m. on a particularly cold Nebraska morning, and while he was making his rounds like any typical night, this patrol would be unlike any other the young officer would ever have, because as he was driving, he would slow down and come to a stop, where he seen lights flashing in the dark. He at first thought it was a truck that had stopped in the middle of the road. It appeared as if the driver was flashing his headlights, possibly due to an emergency. But as Officer Schirmer got closer, this thing sitting in the road flew off. He would casually note in his official report, "I saw a flying saucer at the intersection of Highway 6 and 63, which makes it sound like this was something that happened every day. However, what wasn't noted was what happened afterwards, because Officer Schirmer got a terrible headache and heard a buzzing sound that just would not stop. It would be after he got home and was finally able to sleep that he woke up later that day and discovered a red bump below his left ear. But it wasn't just that. Schirmer soon realized that after seeing this thing fly off into the sky, he had no memory of what had happened for about 20 minutes in that time frame. And although he tried to remember the details of that night, he could never recall. Because of that, he decided he needed to see a psychologist, and he found one. A Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who specialized in hypnotic regression. He would set up an appointment with Schirmer, who made the drive to Wyoming to see him, and after the two met and started their session, Dr. Sprinkle would put him under hypnosis. It was here that Schirmer started to remember bits and pieces of that night. First, he would tell the doctor that his car's radio and engine had just stopped for no apparent reason, and then a white object emerged from the light in the road and began to speak to him telepathically. The being claimed that he was from another world and they had came to stop people from destroying Earth. Schirmer was stunned, as anyone would be, and he had to know more. So after the session, he scheduled a second one with Dr. Sprinkle, which led to more details. Soon, they would meet again, and under hypnosis, Schirmer revealed that this craft was made of a type of metal and had a football-like shape. He specifically remembered its exterior was gleaming. He also felt this overwhelming urge to run, but felt like he was mentally being held back. That's when this being, whom he can now recall more details of, emerged. He stated that it was clad in coveralls and adorned with the winged serpent emblem. The being then directed a greenish gas towards Schirmer's police cruiser, and that is when he seen a bright light flash and passed out. He would wake up minutes later to find himself aboard the craft, in which he explained he saw many computers and control panels. He said the aliens then explained that their spaceship worked on electromagnetism and got its power from big bodies of water. They also noted that radar and ionization made the ship less useful, and they decided to let him go, but not before telling him to not tell anyone about their meeting. They also stated they would come back a couple of more times, which they never did. Schirmer would actually draw a sketch of the figure, which he claimed was not completely human, and was shorter than a typical adult, and if this had just been anybody else's story, he would have been completely forgotten. But considering this was a police officer, it of course brought attention, and a little bit of credibility in the UFO world, although he didn't go that far in the law enforcement world, since he would soon be relieved of his job shortly after the story came out. And despite that, and despite the constant ridicule he got, he never changed his story, all the way up until his death. So what exactly did Schirmer see, assuming he did have an encounter? Let's start with the mundane and work our way down. The most skeptical theory is he was experiencing sleep paralysis, or maybe hypnagogic hallucinations, which could pretty much explain all that he witnessed. Being on a quiet rural road may have triggered a hallucinatory experience for him. These events typically happen in the early morning hours, so that makes sense. But there's an issue with this one. First of all, when he was under hypnosis, he was able to provide a very detailed and very consistent account of the encounter, which would be difficult to do if it was just a brief sleep-induced hallucination. Not to mention, there were other reports of UFO sightings in the area that night. Next, we go to experimental aircraft. This was at the height of the Cold War, and some have speculated that this whole encounter was nothing more than a military test. It's possible that he's seen a secret military aircraft or drone that he mistook for a UFO, and the so-called beings were really just human pilots in advanced flight suits or uniforms, and the so-called telepathic communication he thought he received might have been nothing more than gestures. In fact, there were nearby military installations. However, the craft Schirmer described was way more advanced than anything we know about, at least publicly know. But I know you all want to know the strange theory, that yes, this was an extraterrestrial visitation. I really don't have to go into why this is a theory. I mean, you already know. His account mirrors other abductee stories, but there's just no proof for it. The craft didn't leave any evidence on the road where it allegedly landed. Schirmer's account was almost too close to some of the more popular accounts going around at the time, which suggests he just copied it from what he heard on TV or read in a book. Likewise, hypnosis is notoriously unreliable and prone to creating false memories based on the suggestion of the hypnotist or the subject's expectations. January 4th, 2004, Aurora, Indiana. A 17-year-old high school student, who elected to keep his name private, would have a very strange encounter this winter night around 7:30 p.m. The teen was driving down a country road near town when his headlights soon caught a glimpse of something unexpected. There, on the side of the road, on the passenger side of the car, was a figure crouched down near a puddle. He would pass by and get a closer look at this frail-looking figure and slowed down as he passed and peered at it in the rearview mirror, where he could make out its outline with the taillights of the car. It was then that this thing stood up, and he noted that it was a tall, abnormal figure, around 6.5 foot tall, that seemed to have pointed joints which seemed to buckle out. That being, when it moved, did so in a strange manner. That's when he would go on to describe it as being dark gray or black in color, pencil thin, and was wearing no clothing. The figure then began to walk on two legs towards the woods near the roadside. He stated that he could not see a face or eyes, but he got the feeling that this thing was staring at him. At this point, the young man would roll to a stop at a safe distance away, where he would watch the thing more. It's about that time that another car approached from the opposite way, and the nervous teen watched to see what would unfold. He would see this other driver move along to where the 17-year-old had last seen this strange being moving around. That's when he noticed the other motorist make an evasive maneuver, stop, and then turn the car around and drive back up to where the teen had been parked. They would pull up around him, and an elderly couple got out and walked up to the teen and asked, "Boy, did you see something back there?" It was no human being. It was no man. The boy went on to say that the couple were really spooked by the whole thing, and they offered to follow him on his way to his destination at his friend's home. Once he arrived, he frantically called his mother and told her to lock the doors since the sighting had occurred within 3 miles of their home. As the night wore on though, the kid became hysterical and began calling this being an alien. His uncle, who did not hide his name, a man named Jerry Skadell, would then get involved and told him there had to be a much more simpler explanation and asked him to really think about it. And his nephew conceded that it may have been an improperly dressed elderly person, but still he claimed what he seen was a dark shadowy figure, and that if it was a person, they were super anorexic and were walking around naked in temperatures that were in 20 degrees Fahrenheit weather. Interestingly, Jerry, the uncle, would go to the spot of the encounter about an hour and a half after speaking to his nephew, and he did not see anything. The kid returned to the spot the next day too, once the sunlight was out, and he searched the area, but by this time, 4 inches of snow had fell, and even if there had been tracks, they were now covered. And it's worth noting here that Jerry is the only reason we know about this story, because he contacted a local UFO researcher and made an official report. The kid was also contacted after this, and the researcher stated that he seemed sincere about the encounter. The elderly couple were never found, and never came forward with their version of events. So what did he see? The main theory is just what his uncle said. It was a person, probably someone homeless or mentally ill, or maybe just lost, and was very malnourished. Yet, that doesn't explain how this person was unclothed or barely clothed in freezing temperatures. The second one is obvious. It was just dark, and the lights and shadows were playing tricks on the young driver's eyes. What he thought was a humanoid figure was just a tree shadow or something like that. But this is hard to believe if the elderly couple also seen this being. There's also the thought that it could have been a large animal that appeared to be skinny due to being starving or sick. It's even possible that it was a bear that stood up and walked on 2 legs, but there were no tracks of it or any signs that an animal had been there. And of course, we have to take a look at the supernatural explanations. The big one being, this was an alien of some kind, which explains a lack of clothing or facial features. Of course, squatting at the puddle of water and walking into the forest seems dumb for such an advanced being. Other theories include a cryptid, ghost, or straight up hoax. On the Friday evening of August 15th, 1969, Burlington, Iowa, 48-year-old real estate agent Dorothy Miller would receive a call from a potential buyer of a home located in town. Dorothy, who was the first and only realtor in Burlington, happily accepted the request to go let the man into the home, but she made the cautious decision to take her husband Fred along. Actually, she refused to show properties alone to anyone once nighttime hours began. Now the man had identified himself as a Robert Clark, and he asked Dorothy if she could pick him up at a local pharmacy and give him a ride over to the property. So the Millers did just that, meeting Robert at the pharmacy, which sat near a local tavern that would prove important later on. After touring the property, the Millers took Clark back and dropped him off at the pharmacy where they had picked him up. They found the man pleasant to talk to. As he relayed, he was moving his young family from Des Moines to Burlington, where he had just gotten a job he did not elaborate on. However, he did not make a decision that night, and instead called Dorothy again the next day, a Saturday, and stated he would like to go back to the property to take pictures so he could take them back to his wife to show, and asked Dorothy if she could meet him at the property that night, but she already had plans she could not break, and instead suggested they get together on Monday night at 7:30. The man agreed and told Dorothy he would be at the bar near the pharmacy, known as the Maple Leaf Tavern. He gave her the number and said for her to call it and ask for him. And this is where things get really weird. First of all, those other plans that Dorothy had? Yeah, she actually planned on showing another man a plot of land that night, which everyone found weird because, as mentioned before, she would never go out to meet a prospective buyer at night without her husband. What made it even weirder was Dorothy did not know this man, so it wasn't Robert that she had just met the night before. Furthermore, this plot of land was well out in an isolated rural area. However, it would get that much weirder when this potential buyer did not show up. Dorothy, however, did not think much of it and went on about her business. And when Monday came around, she met with a few buyers to show some properties and wrapped her last showing up a little after 6:30. It would be then between 7 and 7:30 that she would finally call the Maple Leaf Tavern and ask to speak to Robert. Robert was notified, and he walked up and took the call, walked to his black pickup truck to get something out, and walked to the pharmacy where Dorothy picked him up. Now the reason Dorothy's husband did not accompany her was because he drove a truck for a living and routinely laid down by 8:30 at night because he had to wake up at 5 a.m. Plus, after meeting Robert, they felt like everything checked out and neither one of them was worried. Because of these reasons, he did not drive out with Dorothy, and that decision would come back to haunt him. Because by 5 a.m. the next morning, when his alarm clock went off and Fred awoke, he rode over to see Dorothy was not in bed. A quick search of the home took place before he called their daughter to see if maybe she was over there. When they both realized she was missing, they immediately went to the property she had scheduled to show Robert the night before, and they seen nothing out of the ordinary. So they decided to drive over to the pharmacy where she had picked up Robert days ago, and there sat Dorothy's car. They both got out and looked to see the key was still in the ignition, and strangely, a camera flash cube was on the front seat, an item that was used in the 60s to take pictures in low light or in quick succession. Now knowing what else to do, Fred and his daughter Dorothy went to the police, and the first place to search was the obvious, the property that she had taken Robert to look at. So investigators went over, and it was here on the second floor of a bedroom closet that they found Dorothy. It appeared she had been struck in the head after the two entered the home. The killer then tied her hands, pulled off her undergarments, and sexually violated her. He then dragged her to the closet, where he then stabbed her 22 times in the face, neck, and back. Detectives would later describe the murder as sadistic, and noted it was a well-thought-out crime showing sophistication. Detectives started close to the home and worked outwards. First, they spoke to neighbors who stated at 8 p.m. they had been sitting on the porch when Dorothy and a man fitting the description of Robert pulled up in Dorothy's car. Although they never seen anyone leave, they do look out later and notice the car was gone. Even stranger was there had been no cries for help or any sounds of a scuffle. The detectives continued house to house asking for information, but they didn't get very far. They did get a good description from Fred and some of the witnesses, which led to a sketch. He was said to be around 5'10", 175 pounds, good looking, clean cut, and between 20 and 30 years old. What evidence was collected was sent to the state-of-the-art laboratories at the FBI, and obviously, investigators were almost certain Robert Clark was a fake name. Likewise, no one in town recognized him. Even without a lot of evidence to go by, detectives still had a pretty good sound theory. They think the suspect found Dorothy's advertisement in town, or in a phone book, and knew realtors usually go alone, and from that, he began making his plans. He was probably going to do it Friday night, but was thrown off when Fred came along as well. And it was probably at that point that he began spinning the story about needing a home for his young family because he was moving to Burlington. He was trying his best to convince them that he was a good family man, and it worked. They also believed while in the home, he unlocked the back door, which would give him a chance to return on the weekend and leave behind a brick that was thought to have been used to knock her out, along with some nylon rope that had also been found. And then after the crime, he walked out the back door, drove her car, and abandoned it near his vehicle and probably left town. He took a lot of time and effort to concoct this big story, almost like he enjoyed it as much as anything else. In fact, he did not even tell the Millers where he was staying, instead telling the couple to just pick him up at the pharmacy near the tavern, although it is possible he just told her he was driving to town and hanging out at the tavern until she was ready to go look at the home, and just decided to forego getting a room since Des Moines was only a couple hours drive away. Likewise, he also done this so Fred and Dorothy would never see his vehicle. It's only because of people at the tavern that we even know what he was driving, because they told police they seen him retrieve something from his pickup truck, a black pickup truck, and that item he took out was most likely a camera, which was to keep Dorothy from getting suspicious since he told her he was taking pictures of the home for his wife. This also explains the flash cube left behind in Dorothy's car, and taking that item was highly risky for a man who seemed to be so cautious, because these little items pick up fingerprints super easily, although I could not find if police did find them in this case, or if they did and the fingerprints just didn't match up with anything. Regardless, it was sloppy. And although investigators were a few years away from modern criminal profiling techniques that the FBI would become famous for, one man, a mental health care professional in Iowa, Harold Lee, was already doing early criminal profiling, and he believed the suspect was a serial killer, and Dorothy was probably not his first or last victim. He remarked how cunning he was, and how everything he did was methodical and basically left no clues. And that's really our first and main theory, that this was the work of a serial killer, who to this day has never been captured. And while that is crazy itself, there is a wild theory that connects Dorothy Miller's murder with another infamous one, that of Al Kite. And how in the world has anyone came to that conclusion? Well, that goes back to not only the meticulous planning done by the perp, but also the descriptions. Dorothy's suspect identified himself as Robert Clark, Al Kite's as Robert Cooper. Both men were described as being 5'10" and 175 pounds with dark hair. The age is the key question in this one. If Robert Clark was closer to his younger 20s, like some witnesses reported, then he totally could fit Robert Cooper's estimated age of being in his 50s when he killed Al Kite, albeit it's still a stretch, as some of the witnesses described Kite's killer as being in his 40s. Regardless, in both cases, the men played a character. Cooper as an Eastern European man on a cane, while Clark pretended to be a wholesome family man. The planning in both cases were very meticulous. However, there's never been definitive proof that links Dorothy's murder to anyone else's, which could rule out a serial killer. And that brings up the second most likely theory: just an opportunistic predator, a drifter. In fact, there was a carnival in the area at the time, and some speculate that it could have been someone from that, who arranged a meeting with Dorothy after seeing her advertisement, then left town with the show the next day. The problem with this one is, it took a lot of planning, and it doesn't come off as someone getting an idea after seeing an ad and then making all this up on the fly. July 3rd, 1978, Junction City, Kansas. 13-year-old Beverly Ann Ward would invite her 9-year-old friend to come have a sleepover after the two had spent the majority of the day together. Not to mention, the following morning, the two were expected to leave for summer camp. So that night, the girls would share a room with 2 beds and lay down to sleep. But early the next morning around 6 a.m., the family would be awoken to a startling sound. Across the street, a window would be shattered by someone throwing a brick through it. This, of course, led to a disturbance playing out in the neighborhood, and likewise, it woke up the Ward family, who all got up and went to the door and window to look out to see what was going on. Finally, the neighborhood disturbance died down, and the family decided to go back to sleep. That's when the family noticed everyone, including the little girl that had spent the night with the family, had gotten up to peer outside and see what was going on, except for Beverly. This, of course, made the family curious. Had she really slept through all of it? Well, they would get their answer when they stopped by her room to see she was gone. And after looking around the home and realizing she was nowhere to be found, the family called police, who dispatched some officers to the scene. And unlike other cases that take a while to develop, the officers found a major clue as soon as they pulled up. There, in the grass, about 10 yards away from Beverly's windowsill, was the screen that had been cut out from the window. They would go look over Beverly's room, where they found $12 in a bedroom drawer. $12 she intended to use for the camp they were going to. Detectives wasted no time in ruling it a kidnapping, partially because of the fact that Beverly, mental-wise, was a little bit younger than her years indicated, and she was deemed very vulnerable, so the thought that she may have cut the window screen herself and left was quickly ruled out. And because of all these facts, the FBI got involved quickly. They soon come up with a timeline too. They believed whoever had done this did so either at 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. How they came to that conclusion, I was unable to find, but it may have something to do with some witnesses that claimed an unknown car was parked at their house around those times. But because of the darkness, they couldn't make much out about it. And that was pretty much as far as detectives would get, and they faced an uphill battle right from the start. A major roadblock in this investigation was the city itself. Junction City at this time was known as a transient city with lots of drifters coming in through the area. They had so many people that would come in only for a day or two, or maybe a week or two, and leave, never having any real contacts in the area. So investigators started to fear the worst. They suspected one of these hundreds of drifters had seen Beverly playing with her little friend earlier that day, and made plans to come back that night and pull this off, and was conceivably several miles away by now, maybe even a state or two away, and, more than likely, kept moving, meaning tracking her down would be near impossible without a lucky break. Detectives were also confused by some other odd things like, how did the perp, or perps, pull her out of the window without alerting her friend? That girl was interviewed obviously, and she said she heard nothing at all the whole night other than the brick going through the window across the street. Which brings us to the next question. Was that related to this? Or just a random occurrence? Likewise, if people reported seeing the odd car next to the home, how did no one see a prowler moving around near the window? Or someone taking her to the car? These are questions that are still unanswered. Likewise, we don't have any suspects or persons of interest. Well, none that are known publicly at least. They did take in 3 different people for questioning though, but the only thing they had was these people just happened to be in the area at the time. Other than that, there was no hard evidence that suggested they were involved and they were let go. Now police have largely stuck to the belief that it was just somebody passing through town that took her, but there is a twist on this case that suggests something much darker, because a website known as spiritualabuse.org has actually covered her case, And what exactly is this site? And what's its connection to Beverly? Well, it's just as it sounds. It's a site that covers different types of abuse within churches, specifically the United Pentecostal Church, and the Wards were actually involved with the Pentecostal Church. It was known as Faith Tabernacle, and boy oh boy, does this go down a rabbit hole. First of all was Beverly's future brother-in-law, who eventually led the church, and at one point would be arrested for doing, non-consensual things with someone who was not a legal adult. Then his son would take over, who would also be Beverly's nephew, and he got in trouble for abusing some of the women at the church. And he also set these very strict rules on everyone who attended, and basically everyone had their lives constantly monitored by this preacher. Not to mention, they would eventually kick Beverly's mom out of the church because they accused her of witchcraft. And yes, the Wards were attending this church when Beverly disappeared, and that's where things get stranger, because not only did this church not help search for her, or even offer to help in any way possible, they didn't even hold prayer for her. And in the years after this, Beverly's name was only spoken in hushed tones, and basically, the church discouraged anybody from discussing her case. Before we begin theories, I have to note that the family has been completely ruled out. Investigators are confident they are not involved. As far as what happened though, there are two basic lines of thought. The perp, probably a drifter, cut the screen out of the window, threw a rock through the window across the street. While the family was distracted with that, they grabbed Beverly and ran the opposite way. That one to me seems very risky, and I kinda doubt it. I tend to side with the theory that a stranger abducted Beverly after noticing her outside, going up to the window, cutting the screen, and leaving. And the brick going through the window was completely unrelated, and there are still those that believe the church was involved. In either case, police could never find any footprints that showed an intruder had even been around the home. 1995, Michigan, near the Canadian border, a hunter, ironically named Billy Hunter, was out with a group of friends deer hunting when he would get the encounter of a lifetime. As he hid in his spot, finally a group of deer would walk out in front of his path, and just as he started to grab his rifle, he noticed something further back. Behind the deer were rows and rows of trees, and in between the trees, he could make out something moving. Something huge. He would pull his rifle up, which had a scope attached to it. He peered through the scope to get a better look at what this huge creature was, way off in the distance. All of a sudden, his scope caught the movement of the deer, whom, all at one time, looked directly to the right. So he maneuvered his scope into the direction that they were looking, but he saw nothing. He slowly moved his scope back over to the deer, and when he did, he noticed some of them had started slowly walking away, while the others remained focused staring into the direction that they had been. And suddenly, the thing in the background caught his attention again. He saw it moving around, so he focused in on it, zooming his scope in. He would see it on a low branch of a very big tree, a tree covered in snow, which made it difficult to see the animal, because it too was stark white. It made it hard for him to track and distinguish what it was he was actually seeing. And while he's sitting there watching this, not for sure what he was really seeing, he noticed what he thought was a big piece of snow that seemed to crawl for a second. And suddenly, whatever this huge thing was landed heels first in the snow and charged at the last few deer left behind. It was so quick that they didn't even have time to move. Now Billy was by himself, because the other hunters had taken up different positions, but they all stayed in contact via handheld radios. And they all see this playing out and begin panicking. Billy would recall that one of the men began trying to pronounce the scientific name of this huge bird because, from this angle, he thought that whatever this thing was had flew down from the tree. Then, the guy that they deemed the general of the hunt got on the radio and told everyone to mark their areas and told Billy the shot was his to take, since it was directly in front of him. So while this thing was attacking the deer, Billy pulls up to shoot, and hits it. He assumed anyways, because the animal never flinched and just kept attacking the deer. He was shocked. Not only could he not identify this animal, it seemed like the shot from this rifle had no effect, so he fired another shot, and finally, the animal turned and ran away. Billy would go on to state that he was for sure this was not a polar bear, which would make sense because that would be way out of their range. However, Billy could not identify what the animal was, other than stating it was some kind of hybrid, mixed between a polar bear, Arctic wolf, ape, and some kind of big cat. Specifically, he noted that it ran like a cat. He also described it as having thick white fur, black skin, and a flat face, with small ridges on its body like a reptile. And despite its huge body, it was surprisingly light on its feet. Strangely, he would also note that although it didn't stand on its hind legs, Billy suspected that it could. So what exactly did these hunters see that day? Well, it seems they encountered a cryptid known as the Booger bear, or bulldog bear. Animals that live mainly around the mountainous regions of the United States and Canadian border. They're noted for being very large and having characteristics of both cats and dogs, but are often compared to gorillas or lions. The first documented sighting occurred in 1956, and it actually ties back to a cryptid we discussed before, the living short-faced bear. This animal was very real, but it's supposed to have went extinct millennia ago. But some cryptozoologists believe a small population survived and could account for what Billy seen that day. Of course, the most plausible theory is they really just seen a bigger than normal sized bear that had been covered in snow and simply misidentified it. And we have to finish with another obvious one. This whole thing was a hoax. Take a good look at this photo. This girl's name is Yerlanin Garcia. She was only 12 years old at the time of her disappearance from Eagle Grove, Iowa, a town of about 4,000 people. The photo, which is very grainy and of poor quality, doesn't give much in the way of a description. However, we do know she was about 4'3" and 100 pounds with black hair and brown eyes, at least at the time of her disappearance. But it's this photo, or maybe the copy of a photo, along with the lack of details, that really makes this mystery disturbing to me. Because, well, you can barely make anything out. And I know most of you are probably sitting there saying, insomnia, this is not uncommon with old cases. Many times, all we have is an old grainy photo that is almost useless. Likewise, it's not really uncommon to have a black and white copy of an old photo, thus making the identification that much more complicated. But see, that's the catch with this one. This old photo of Yerlanin Garcia is not so old. That's right, she disappeared in 2010, which, with the lack of details, paints a disturbing, eerie mystery. From what is known, which I emphasize again, is very little. She was reported missing on January 15th, 2010, and was said to have been seen at her house around 9 p.m. that night. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, her case details weren't even added to the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, or NAMUS for short, until February 2021, 11 years after she seemingly disappeared. But who actually reported her disappearance first? We don't know. Well, what were the details of her disappearance? We don't know that either. There's actually 0 news articles about her, which you would think, in a town of 3,600 people, the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl would at least make local headlines. But, nope, there's no hits. There's also another odd fact to this story. Judging by the weather records from this time and date, it would have been around 20 degrees. Not surprising for an Iowa winter, which suggests if she did run away, it probably wasn't on foot. But really, the craziest part we have to come back to is this photo. One that looks like it was taken in the early 20th century. Or maybe a photocopy of one from a case in the 1980s. It's hard to believe that someone in 2010 didn't have a cell phone that could take a better photo of her. Or if they did take a photo, it's hard to believe that law enforcement in the area could not simply upload it, instead making a black and white copy of it and then uploading it. Heck, there's gotta be school photos out there with better quality. So is this just a lazy police department or something else? Speaking of the police, did they even search for her? Did they take the report seriously? Did volunteers help in a search? Were neighbors interviewed? If they did, there's no record of any of these. Speaking of records, she also does not show up in NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Adding to the intrigue is the lack of an appeal from the family or other loved ones. No Facebook pages looking for tips, no loved ones out there looking to do interviews on podcasts, or hitting up local media in an attempt to get the story out. So it's all these reasons. One may ask, is she even real? If so, is she still missing? Well, According to Iowa authorities, she is, since she is still listed as a missing person. This case reminds me a lot of the Joanna Lopez mystery, which is why I wanted to cover it. I'm sure you are familiar with Joanna Lopez's case, as we have covered it before. But it was a young woman that allegedly went missing in Chicago in 1989, and a poor quality photo would pop up in public service announcements with no details about her case, in spite of the fact she was not listed in the official missing person records. Some even think the whole thing is a hoax, and I think Garcia might be a modern-day version of that mystery, although I don't believe her case is a hoax. Now, unlike Lopez, we may have someone that could vouch for Garcia's existence. Maybe. The case this website is listed on is iowacodecases.org, and it has a comment section below each case. And on her page, a commenter claims to have been Yerlanin's teacher at Clarion, about a 15-minute drive from where she disappeared. This person states she believes that she was living with her grandmother or father when she was reported missing. Now, this is the internet, and anyone can make a comment on that webpage, so it's hard to judge the veracity of the claim. But even if it's true, it still doesn't tell us much of anything. It's also worth noting that there are several commenters there who claim to be locals, stating they have never even heard of the case. Actually, awareness on her disappearance is basically non-existent, and that's pretty much it on this one. So many questions. Who was she? Who reported her? What's the case status? Did she really disappear in 2010? How come records don't come online until 2021? Why is the only picture available appear to be much older than what it really is? Hopefully, we can get some answers soon. April 27th, 2006. Sometime around noon in Webbers Falls, Oklahoma, which is a town with a tiny population of about 600 people, and would play host to this next sad and strange mystery, when a resident was driving down a gravel road in a very rural and isolated area, and would see something that he couldn't quite make sense of. Alongside this old road was a ditch, and it appeared a woman was just sitting there, but something didn't seem to be right about her. It was unsettling. As he got closer and pulled over to take a look, he soon realized this woman was dead. Of course, this unfortunate passerby would call the police, who were soon on the scene, and what they found was even more disturbing. The woman was in a semi-seated position, and her hand was still clutching onto a bloody towel, which was draped over her lower abdomen, while another bloody towel was sitting beside her. Detectives looked over the scene and soon established that the victim had been placed on the ground, not dumped. Whoever done this had stopped and dragged her to the embankment and set her up so she would be found. The woman was also fully clothed except for her shoes, and there were no signs of an assault or any struggle at all. After finding no identification on her, they would send her body to the medical examiner's office to find the cause of death, which they already had a good idea about, considering all the blood had came from her vaginal area. The medical examiner was able to conclude she had been dead by midnight at least, and she was deceased when she was set down at the location about 12 hours prior, and as the investigators suspected, she had died from an intense vaginal hemorrhage, caused either by an abortion or a miscarriage. Investigators were not sure which had occurred, and they really have no idea today because they have never established who this person was, as no one has ever came forward to identify her. At first, they thought they had a pretty good idea of what had happened. The woman most likely had a miscarriage, but was in the country illegally and avoided going to the hospital. But her being an illegal immigrant has been practically ruled out today. Now investigators began to look closer to home. They began to wonder if she was a Native American, specifically part of the Muskogee Nation, which resides in Oklahoma. But even that they were not sure of, as some clues point to the thought that it might have been a white woman of Greek descent, or possibly of South Asian descent. Whatever the case, she was around 30 years old, 5'3", 150 pounds, and had brown hair with a reddish tint. As far as what did happen, investigators are unsure, but if it was a botched abortion, that leaves other pressing questions, like why did this person set her out to be found? It's almost like the person did care, because you would typically think, in an incident with malice, the body would be hidden. Instead, she was placed where she would soon be found. It also goes along with the evidence, or maybe I should say, lack of evidence, that she was an abuse victim. There were no bruises, no other signs of trauma, or anything that would indicate that. Although, it is possible that the person that placed her here just didn't find her until rigor mortis set in, which explains the seated position. Perhaps she was sitting in the floor when she bled out. But if we go back to the miscarriage theory, that too does not make sense, since investigators are now pretty confident she wasn't an illegal alien, so why not seek medical care? Of course, others suspect a much more grim theory, that she was the victim of trafficking. This case, as dark as it is, will probably have an answer soon. They have DNA, and although I can't find an update on it, I have to assume they are trying to establish her identity via genetic genealogy, something that takes a little bit longer with Native American DNA, since there is not a wider pool of candidates to draw from. Our next cryptid mystery comes from an obscure origin, the Wisconsin newspaper, the La Crosse Tribune, which on March 19, 1908, would pen a very short article that had a headline which read, "Beast Causes Terror." Amazingly, for such a crazy story, it was only glossed over, but it told the story of a town called Eau Claire in Wisconsin, whose residents were waking up and finding that their livestock had been attacked and devoured by a wild animal that appeared to be cat-like. More frighteningly was at least one instance when this beast had stalked the child of a local farmer before it was spooked off. That article, as mentioned, was very short and, strangely, was never followed up on, but it soon gave rise to the cryptid we now know as the Beast of Eau Claire. Although it wasn't followed up on by this newspaper, several reported sightings would be made over the next century. But what exactly was it? That goes back to the very classic cryptid which we actually discussed in the Southern series, and it's basically a black panther. While sightings were sporadic and known only to local townsfolk for many years, that would change close to 100 years later when in 2001, a woman leaving her late shift job was traveling down the highway when she seen something up ahead on the side of the road that appeared to be crouching, like it was about to pounce on her prey. She thought more than likely it was a very large dog, but it was strange enough that she wanted to slow down and get a better look. It slowly raised from its crouched position, and she stated you could clearly see it was a large feline with glowing red eyes, and was about the size of a bear. The woman, even though inside the car, was still terrified and sped away. If it was just that one account, it wouldn't mean much, but just a year later in 2002, it would be sighted again, almost under identical circumstances. It was again a woman leaving her late shift job around 11 p.m., and she was driving down the same highway when she would see an animal off to the side of the road, a large animal. As she slowed down to get a better look, the headlights illuminated the beast, which she recalled was a wildcat that was all black and about the size of a bear, and heavily muscled. This was the last official sighting of the Beast of Eau Claire. However, there's been a ton of large cat sightings in the state. In fact, between 2002 and 2018, residents in Wisconsin reported more than 2,400 large cat sightings. Maybe the most famous was the Milwaukee Lion, which was picked up on a camera near a park in 2015. And this was taken very seriously, as officers actually responded and tried to hunt the animal. Some of them using tranquilizers, others using real ammo in case the tranquilizers failed. However, they never found the cat, and because of the graininess of the picture, it's unsure if it was a cougar or just a really large bobcat. Whatever it was though, was picked up on camera just 2 years later, this time pretty much conclusively proven to be a cougar. And that's the other thing about this one. Unlike the South, where wildlife officials still swear that there are no cougars in the area, Wisconsin officials have cited that there is no breeding population in the state, that however, they do occasionally drift over to hunt in the area. So with that, does this mean the Beast of Eau Claire was just a cougar, aka mountain lion? Possibly, but it doesn't explain its black color, unless witnesses are just mistaken. I mean, it was nighttime, but they also reported that the animal was as big as a bear. which doesn't seem likely, although maybe they were just mistaken on that account too. Others suggest that it was probably a different animal altogether, possibly a bear or a wolf, or maybe just a large dog. Lying in the sparsely populated town of Peebles, Ohio, is a National Historic Landmark whose history is not clearly understood. I am, of course, talking about Serpent Mound. Chances are you have heard of it, especially if you live on the East Coast. At close to 1,400 feet long, the mound is the largest serpent effigy in the world. Its height varies from close to 1 foot high at some points and 3 foot high at other points, while the width ranges from 20 to 25 feet. And it was built on a bluff above a creek where it winds back and forth for more than 800 feet, while its tail is coiled in 7 different areas. Near the open mouth of the serpent is a hollow oval feature that anthropologists and historians alike disagree on. Some believe it represents an egg being devoured by the snake, while others believe it represents the snake devouring the sun, which could point at a solar eclipse. Some believe it doesn't represent anything and that the oval feature used to be a spot where a platform stood. It was first documented in the late 17th century by early European explorers, but it wasn't actually surveyed and studied until 1848. And while a lot has been learned since that time, it is still pretty mysterious. Actually, throughout the 20th century, anthropologists and archaeologists have argued back and forth over who actually created the mound. Part of that comes down to not actually knowing when it was built. However, current radiocarbon dating suggests that it was started as early as 300 BC, and who was here at that time exactly? That is a mystery too, but it is credited to the Adena culture, who lived in Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But it's important to point out here that these people were not one group. Instead, it was tons of similar tribes all over the Midwest who sorta had similar cultures, but were not one people. Although there was trade and relations between some of them. It's that issue that really stops anyone from knowing who exactly built it, especially since one of the things they did share was their complex burial and ceremonial system. The Adena culture only lasted between 1000 BC and 100 AD before it basically faded away. During this same time and area, the Hopewell culture was also active between 100 BC and 500 AD, which means they overlapped each other for about 200 years. And interestingly, the Hopewell was completely different from the Adena. But the reason they are important to this mystery is, after the Adena disintegrated, the Hopewell took over and basically absorbed and expanded upon their culture and traditions. Although some say the Adena just morphed into the Hopewell. But it's the Hopewell that would become famous for the building of those large complex earthen mounds that can be found across the Midwest today. But important to our mystery is that the Hopewell continued to follow the old ways of the Adena, and they would continue work on the Serpent Mound. And we don't know how much was constructed at this point, but they would maintain it and possibly add to it. But just as the Adena went, so did the Hopewell, and they faded away after a few centuries, only to be replaced by the Fort Ancient culture. Although DNA testing has ruled out that there was any blood link between the two, but the Fort Ancient culture would remain active until it disintegrated in 1750 AD, well after the Europeans were inhabiting the country. But it's the Fort Ancient culture that many give credit to as being the sole creators of the mound, or at least adding to it so much that it made it completely different and much more complex than what it originally was, although some historians dispute that. That is a mystery unto itself, and one we will not tackle. Instead, we're going to look at why. Why build this? Archaeologists believe the major part of the mound we know of today was created around 1070 AD, and it's possible that it was created because of a supernova. In fact, the one in the year 1054 AD, which created the Crab Nebula, would be visible in the sky for 2 weeks, even during the daytime. There was also the appearance of Halley's Comet, which appeared in 1066 AD, that may have also influenced it. Others have disputed this, of course, and point out that the oval to the head area that many think is an egg, actually perfectly aligns to the summer solstice sunset, while its tail points to the winter solstice sunrise. Others tied its coils to lunar phases, while others tie it to ancient gods that these cultures had, while there are more wilder theories that suggest it was some kind of timekeeping device or maybe a celestial event marker. August 27th, 1979, Stephen, Minnesota. Deputy Sheriff Val Johnson was on his routine night patrol around 2 a.m. when he would end up having one of the more significant UFO encounters in history. It all started when the patrolman was driving along and seen a beam of light just above the road. This light, which was bright white and well defined, was about 8 to 12 inches in diameter and 3 to 4 feet off the ground, and it made Johnson think that an aircraft above him was in distress. So he began driving towards the light, but to his surprise, the light began moving rapidly towards him, and, according to Johnson, covered about 1.5 miles almost instantaneously. Then it engulfed his car, and in the process, blinded Johnson, who soon heard the sound of glass breaking. What happened after this is anyone's guess, because Johnson would fall unconscious for 39 minutes, and when he woke up, he noticed his car was stalled and had skidded across the highway. He felt very sluggish and shaky, and he radioed for assistance at 2:19 a.m., stating that his vehicle had been attacked by something. But when his fellow lawmen got there, they were greeted by a strange scene. The vehicle's driver's side headlight, the inside one, was smashed, while the outer one remained intact. There was also a circular dent about 1/2 inch in diameter on the left side of the hood. The windshield had also cracked on the driver's side with 4 impact points. They then looked towards the roof antenna, which had been bent at a 60-degree angle 6 inches from the base, while the trunk antenna had been bent at a 90-degree angle near the top. Even stranger was Johnson's watch, which was 14 minutes behind, along with the patrol car's clock. Looking over the scene showed that the car had traveled 854 feet from where Johnson claimed the light had intercepted him, while 99 feet of skid marks were also left before the vehicle stopped sideways on the road. Once a doctor examined Johnson, he discovered bruises on him, along with eye irritation that the doctor said was similar to that of a welder's burn, which is the painful inflammation of the cornea caused by exposure to UV light coming from a welding torch. Lastly, Johnson also had some fractured teeth at the gum line. His law enforcement friends didn't just take his word for it. They did investigate and came up with nothing. They even contacted Ford engineers to ask about the vehicle's damage. Interestingly, when it came to the windshield fractures, they noted it had been made by simultaneous inward and outward forces, and it was extremely unusual. Detectives, for their part, ruled out collision, hoax, and a low-flying aircraft. They claimed they just couldn't find any proof for any of these, and as surprising as this was, Johnson was in no way prepared for what would happen next, because he soon found that this story was not only being talked about locally, it was picking up a ton of steam in the national press. And within 2 weeks, he was invited to appear on the Good Morning America program. However, it didn't last long, because Johnson would eventually tell reporters that the sudden influx of attention was starting to cause a great deal of emotional strain on the family, and he soon stopped taking interviews. But maybe most suspiciously of all, Johnson refused to take a polygraph test because he believed it, quote, would only satisfy people's morbid curiosity. And besides, if you follow enough true crime mysteries, you already know polygraphs are useless. But in spite of that, it does add doubts to Johnson's story. Although, something did happen to his car. What that was, we don't know. But some skeptics claim that he damaged the car intentionally, all to pull off this hoax. However, many ufologists consider this to be one of the more important UFO encounters ever, with Jerome Clark stating that it was one of the top 10 most influential, citing Johnson's reputation as a law enforcement officer, as well as the physical evidence left behind, and the fact that he didn't really have much to gain and a heck of a lot to lose. He also quickly got out of the limelight and didn't cash in on his story. Actually, he grew tired of it quick and uprooted his life and family and moved to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where he avoided talking about the event anymore. He did eventually become chief of police in Oslo, Minnesota, before retiring to a customer service job. He would state in one of the few interviews he did many decades after the event that he still couldn't explain it. And I know you are dying to hear the theories on this one, so let's start with the obvious. It was a real extraterrestrial encounter. This could explain why there was so much evidence that something had collided with the vehicle, while no evidence of what slammed into him was left behind. Likewise, it could possibly explain the burns to his eyes. Others suggest that Johnson may have ran into something almost as rare as aliens, that of ball lightning, which can appear as a bright orb and can cause electrical disturbances, but that doesn't explain the damage left to the vehicle. Of course, it's also possible Johnson was drunk and crashed, and then his police friends covered up for him, but that doesn't explain the burns to his eyes. All in all, a crazy one. September 9th, 1972, Grand Island, Nebraska. It was the opening of the college football season, a huge day in Nebraska where seemingly everyone follows Cornhusker football. But it was on this day that 53-year-old William Peak and his 50-year-old wife, Bernice, along with their 14-year-old daughter, Barbara, were alone in their beautiful home after an abrupt change of plans. See, Bernice's old college friend, a lady named Georgia Stone, along with her husband, had invited the Peaks over to their cabin in South Bend, about a 1 hour and 50-minute drive away. But Bernice would call Georgia sometime before the drive and let them know she wasn't feeling good and they weren't going to make it, but would see them later on. But the real reason she canceled might have to do with the Peaks making other plans. In fact, Bernice's parents were actually coming over later that evening to watch the Nebraska game with their daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter. Now the families must have been pretty close, because Bernice's parents showed up later that evening and simply let themselves into the home, where they sat down and waited on Bernice or William to come down and greet them. But they never did. Even stranger was the family's dog. An English setter named Meridoc was barking like crazy, and the dog would not let up. And it was then that Bernice's father, Ron, felt like the dog was trying to get him to follow her. So he did. And when he began walking, the dog went to the master bedroom, and Ron pushed the door open and discovered a nightmare. There was his son-in-law, William Peak, dead, along with his 14-year-old granddaughter, Barbara, and his daughter, Bernice, who was still clinging to life. The white carpets the family laid on were soaked with blood, and Ron looked across the room at the sliding glass door that led to the patio and the lake, which was nearby, and assumed that the perp had escaped that way. But he didn't have time to speculate, and he called an ambulance for his daughter, who might actually survive the onslaught. The police arrived on scene too, and soon began carrying out their investigation. They looked over everything and were a bit puzzled. First of all, there were no signs of a struggle, nor were there any signs that either one of the girls had been sexually violated. And for Bill, he was strangely lying with his cigarette near his hand, while his lighter was under his body, while Bernice was draped over his body, and Barbara had died near a dresser. They were all victims of gunshot wounds. The earliest theory detectives had wasn't a bad one, because it wasn't much later that they found Bill's credit cards in another part of town, while his wallet was found on the other side of town. I could not find if the cards had been used though, but considering they didn't pursue the robbery theory long, I kinda doubt it. In either case, no fingerprints were found on either of them, so investigators were at a loss. Now strangely, there was one rumor that hung in the air for a while. This rumor suggested that the Peaks were about to reveal a wife-swapping arrangement. Now I looked for more details on this, but could not find anything, so I'm not sure if it was their wife-swapping arrangement, and for some reason they were about to go public, which I doubt, or if they knew of another couple that were involved in it, and for whatever reason, they wanted to expose it, and this embarrassed the couple, who then killed them over it. Regardless, police must not have thought much about it, because they didn't really pursue it. But there was a crazier theory. See, Bill had been in the military his whole life up to that point, and he was an intelligence officer. Actually, it's never been disclosed what he did exactly, but we do know he served on the Eastern Bloc at the height of the Cold War. So detectives began to wonder, did a Soviet spy track him down all the way to Grand Island, Nebraska, just to get rid of him? For some kind of spy versus spy reasons, This is why the US government became interested in the case. However, there was one thing that stuck out. They kind of pointed away from this. It was sloppy. Why would they leave Bernice alive if this was some kind of Soviet secret operation? Investigators were now back at square one, but this is where Bernice's brother would come in, a real fighter for her case. Bob Allen and his wife Georgine had been attending the Nebraska game in LA and heard the news after they left the game and flew back home immediately. The well-to-do businessman became a champion for her cause, putting pressure on the local government to find the killer, along with contacting several governors over the years trying to find a resolution to the case. And at first, he may have actually helped, because right after, police got a tip about two long-haired young men seen in the area on the night of the murder, and they were driving a blue Impala with Nebraska plates. These men were actually found way over in Billings, Montana, about an 11.5-hour drive away. They were picked up by local authorities there for drug possession. Soon, Grand Island detectives would fly out to interview them, and came up with nothing. Meanwhile, tips from all over poured in. One deputy would even go to Las Vegas running down a lead, which didn't pan out. Bernice's brother Bob, for his part, was convinced that it was a voyeur or peeper who had been spying on his niece, 14-year-old Barbara, and then got caught and panicked and killed the family over it. But this one seemed odd, since police couldn't find any evidence of that, nor had Barbara been violated. But back to Bernice, who was now in the hospital, and told detectives that it was multiple people that had shot them. But there was one issue with this. Bernice was in no condition to talk. Actually, she was speaking incoherently, and she couldn't even write anything other than illegible scribbles. So, her saying multiple people involved meant very little. But the good news was, doctors thought she was recovering. However, this would change, and a couple of weeks later, police were advised by doctors to not ask her any more questions. She held on a couple more months before succumbing to the wounds, never being well enough to provide clues to the murders. It was this that caused Bob to redouble his efforts. He offered reward after reward, starting off with $10,000, which, adjusted for inflation, is about $60,000 now, and he even eventually upped that money in 2008, 36 years after the crime, to $100,000, before he would pass away 2 years later. And that's pretty much it. We have zero in ways of DNA, so unless there's a deathbed confession, this one will almost certainly never be solved. But that doesn't mean we can't discuss theories, and it's basically the three we already brushed over. The big one was Bill's days as an intelligence officer could suggest it was a professionally executed hit. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, and because of the execution style, it comes off as well planned. But there's no real proof that's what it was, although I'm unsure if the CIA would disclose that anyways. Second was, what if Bob was right? What if it was a voyeur? I can never find where he got his lead for this, or what made him think that, but he was convinced. And he had hired private investigators, so maybe he had a good lead. Maybe they weren't even spying on Barbara, and instead were spying on Bernice. And in either case, he could have escalated. Maybe Bill caught him, and then it spun out of control. The downside to this is, peeping Toms are not really the type you would think to go around heavily armed. There are also those that believe it was a crime of passion, related to wife swapping, and because of the taboo of the situation, the investigators just didn't really want to go down that avenue. Finally, it might have been those two perps caught with drugs in Montana, and investigators could just never find that piece of conclusive evidence to arrest them. July 19th, 2011, Goldsby, Oklahoma. Bill Shipley was getting his supplies ready for a trip back north to Kansas. The 47-year-old was a contract painter that would often travel around the Midwest taking on different jobs. It's because of this reason that when Bill left and didn't speak to anyone in his family for a few weeks, they didn't suspect anything. But as time wore on, his family began to wonder, had he made it back from Kansas yet? Did he take on another job and not tell them? Something wasn't making sense. His family, mainly his mom and dad and his sister, would eventually drive over to his house to check on him, and that's when they found a strange scene. First of all was Bill's vehicles, or lack thereof. The truck that Bill used to haul around his painting equipment was gone, which was not unusual but his pickup truck that he used for regular driving was also missing, which was odd because he lived alone. So when the family got there, they immediately got an unsettling feeling, and they noticed the door to the home was wide open, which made things worse. Standing outside, they could see that the lights were off, and they walked in and flicked the light switch, and the light didn't come on. The power had been turned off. Looking around revealed even stranger clues. First of all was Bill's beloved cat, which had no food and no water and hadn't in quite a while and had almost died. Likewise, all of Bill's clothing and belongings that he planned to take with him were all neatly packed and still set in their bags ready to go, like he had left abruptly, which will prove more confusing for what transpired later on. Obviously, his family's concern grew and they immediately called the police, who began their own investigation. It was unfortunate for everyone involved that this was weeks after Bill had last talked to anyone in the family, so no one was quite sure where to even look. I mean, they knew he headed to Kansas, but since he took no bags but both vehicles, something didn't add up. However, it didn't take long for the first clue to come up. It was about a month after Bill's disappearance, on August 20th, that his work truck was found in Oklahoma City, about a 25-minute drive north, at an apartment complex. When investigators looked it over, they soon realized that all of his work equipment, which consisted of lights, ladders, cans of paint, and airless sprayers, were gone. Detectives also learned after talking to a neighbor that Bill's trucks had not disappeared at the same time. First, it was his everyday truck, and a week later, his neighbor noticed that the work truck had disappeared as well. Interestingly, the truck that Bill used for his everyday vehicle would be found at another complex in Oklahoma City a year later, and it apparently had been sitting there for several months. Regardless, there was no blood or signs of a struggle in either vehicle. Of course, investigators thought this was strange and didn't really know what to make of it. However, it would take on another twist because investigators would begin searching the route that Bill would have taken to get to Oklahoma City, and they would check with stores and the like, looking for surveillance footage from the last day that Bill had talked to his family, and they got lucky. They found video of him at a Sonic restaurant, which was about 5 minutes from his home. What made this sighting intriguing was the footage suggested that Bill had a passenger in the vehicle with him. This passenger, though, is never shown and was never identified. However, police did make a very public plea for this person to come forward and talk to investigators, and he or she never did. But that's not the scariest part. That would come after detectives began looking at Bill's credit card transactions. Apparently, someone in Norman, about a 15-minute drive away, had been using Bill's credit card at several locations in town, like at a gas station, a steakhouse, and a Home Depot. And this man would actually be caught on camera. The photos aren't great, as you can see here, but it should have been enough to easily identify him, especially since the person was using the card not far from where Bill lived. Not to mention, the sketch was done pretty well too. With that information, police now looked at Bill's other financial details and soon realized before his disappearance, he had taken out over $3,000 from his ATM, which police assumed was to be used to finance his upcoming trip to Kansas, and somewhat suspiciously, he left $7,200 in the account. So simple motive, right? Bill took out that $3,000 and then got robbed. But there was one issue with that. That $3,000 that Bill took out immediately got spent on the paint supplies needed for the upcoming job in Kansas. For detectives' part, they have never speculated on who the person was spotted with Bill at Sonic's, and it's unsure if that is even related to what happened to Bill. But the man using his card at the locations in town is definitely a person of interest. But where should detectives even begin to look? First was a theory presented by the family. They noted that Bill often carried around $3,000 to $5,000 in his wallet because he was a contractor and often had to pick up paint supplies. They believed someone at one of these supply stores, like a Home Depot, repeatedly, or maybe just once, seen Bill take this large sum of money out of his wallet, and they followed him home. That doesn't explain, though, why the other $7,000 was never removed, and why the perp only ended up making a few purchases with this credit card. However, there was another thought along those same lines. Interestingly, Bill had posted a Craigslist ad looking for a painter's helper. Detectives could never verify if anyone replied, and if they had, did they meet Bill, and then had other ideas in mind? Again, the problem is, it seems like such a risky move when the perp didn't end up with very much. The case is still unsolved over a decade later, but today, the motive seems pretty obvious: financial. Investigators have also said they believe at least 2 people were involved. As far as how it was done, that is the strange part. Was it someone from the Craigslist ad? If so, was the real goal just to steal all of Bill's paint supplies? If so, did he resell them? That seems pretty dumb when he could have just stolen the money beforehand. And what about the unidentified passenger? Was this person involved, or was it just random? Did he or she plan the whole thing out with the guy that would be spotted on the security video? That man did appear to be with a woman. So, were they behind it together? However, maybe the most likely theory is it was just a simple robbery gone wrong that was planned at the last minute. Someone did see him in the store waving around that money and wrongly assumed that Bill had more on him and followed him back home, snuck in behind him, or convinced Bill to let him in, and then tried to rob him, only to find out that Bill had spent the majority of the money buying supplies. This caused the person to panic, kill Bill, dispose of the body, go and hide that one truck, return with an accomplice, and steal the other truck and leave it abandoned somewhere. But unless someone confesses, or a DNA break comes in this case, this one will probably remain cold for quite a while. March 2009. Residents of Manhattan and Lawrence, Kansas would be shocked at an announcement that was given to them by both local and state investigators. It seems for years that there had been an unknown predator stalking the state's biggest universities, that of Kansas in Lawrence, and Kansas State in Manhattan. Now, because this is YouTube, I have to be careful, and I can't use his nickname or say specifically what it was he was accused of doing, but we will get around it. Basically, he was breaking into the off-campus homes of female students, and we'll say violating them. It actually started way back on October 2nd, 2000, when the first victim was attacked. Now, because of the sensitivity of these crimes, police understandably have kept things close to the vest. But what we do know shows a very steady pattern. But before we discuss that, let's look at the timeline. As we mentioned, the first attack took place on October 2nd, 2000, and it happened at the 2200 block of College Avenue in Manhattan. That is significant because the following 2 attacks would also happen at that same exact block over a 3-year period. After this, he would hit 3 more locations in Manhattan between December 2002 and June 2004. One of these he hit twice, that of the 1400 block of Watson Place. And remember that, because it will be important later on. After this, maybe he felt like the heat was on, or he was getting paranoid, because he would switch it up and move to Lawrence, Kansas, which is about an hour-and-a-half drive away. From July 2004 until December 2008, he would rotate back and forth, hitting locations in both cities. And in total, from October 2000 to December 2008, 13 assaults occurred. Now again, because police haven't released a lot of info, I'm unsure how long it took detectives to connect the dots. Had they known for years and were trying to keep it quiet in hopes of nabbing the perp? Or did they have no idea and only made their announcement in March 2009 after they finally figured out these were not separate incidents? What is known is that as early as 2003 and 4, warnings by officials were given out to students to make sure to keep their doors and windows locked, meaning they may have started suspecting that there was a serial offender around that time. However, after the assault in December 2008, it would only be about 3 months later in March that the police would have the press conference to announce that there was a serial offender on the loose. Now remember when I said to keep the 1400 block of Watson Place in the back of your mind? Well, that's because after this press conference by the police, the man who now has the less offensive moniker, Midwest Monster, went dormant for 7 years, only to strike one last time in July 2015 at Watson Place, making it 11 years since he had hit that area. And that would be the last time we would ever hear from this man, at least officially, because it's speculated that there are other victims who just didn't come forward. But you might be thinking, These crimes all occurred post-2000. Don't we have the tools to easily nab this guy? Yeah, about that. We have to go back to the MO. In every incident, the assault occurred off campus on a young lady between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. The girl was always asleep, only to be awoken and see him standing there with a gun. And not coincidentally, all the attacks that happened, except for one, occurred when there was a break from school, for example, over the holidays. The trickiest part was how he was getting in. In almost every case, detectives deduced the point of entry. However, just how he got in is still a mystery. Numerous victims were certain that the door had been locked, yet there were no signs of forced entry, which could indicate that he had the ability to pick locks, or somehow had access to the keys, or the scarier thought, he had gotten in prior and was just waiting in the home, hiding somewhere, which is made odder by the fact that many of the dwellings were not all the same. Some were apartments, some were duplexes, and some were single-family homes. Detectives also found that in many of the cases, the victim had been under surveillance for weeks leading up to the attacks, and in all but 2 cases, the victim was alone. Once getting inside, he would wake them up and force them into submission with a gun, while more recent information that was released via a podcast in 2025 documented that he also brought zip ties, a tripod, and a camera. While in one case, the victim reported getting 2 phone calls before the attack, in which the person on the other end remained silent. And in one attempted attack, he stopped and told the victim, "You're not the right one," and abruptly left, suggesting he had a very specific type of target. He would also use a condom and gloves and make his victim shower extensively and brush her teeth afterwards, which is why today we have 0 evidence in DNA. These were also not quick attacks and would last for hours, and the perp acted cold and calculated. Now, although he did wear a ski mask, there were a few times that the victim seen him, which is where we got a description and sketch. He was white and between 5'9" and 6 foot, and 2 things that were described consistently was his pronounced belly and strong thigh muscles. His age was thought to be about 18 at the time of the first attack in 2000, and 33 at the time of the last one in 2015, meaning he would be in his early 40s now. The shift from Manhattan to Lawrence is odd too, because it could be that he was feeling the heat and just decided to move his base of operations. But considering all the reconnaissance he was doing beforehand, it seems improbable that he wouldn't be there for another reason, which has led many to suggest that his job had something to do with property management or maintenance, which would do away with the lockpicking theory and give him access to master keys for all the apartment blocks. Or, as others have postulated, he may have been living in Topeka, Kansas, which is almost the halfway point between Lawrence and Manhattan. Then we have the period where he stopped, which people find particularly interesting. If he was 18 when the attack started, by 2008, he would have been 26, which is when he stopped for a period of 7 years. Did he really stop because of the press conference? Or could it be he got married, had children, or did he get arrested for something else? And why did he only hit once in 2015 and disappear again? This is one of those bizarre ones where one would think, since it happened in the modern day, that the technology would eventually catch him. But he cleaned up the crime scene so well that, in a way, is reminiscent of Mr. Cruel, that he left police without any clues. Today, most people believe he was most likely some kind of maintenance man who was working for a contracting company and had access to a master key for several properties, where he would then stake out the girl for several weeks at a time. If not that, he could have been some kind of delivery driver, like a UPS man, pizza delivery, or maybe even an Uber driver, something of that nature. Maybe even someone posing as a utility man for the cable or electric company, tricking victims by coming off as a legitimate serviceman. April 13th, 1897, Neilwood, Illinois. It was about 2:30 in the day when 3 men were out tending to their farm in this small town in the central part of the state. And it's here, tilling the field in the nice spring weather, that they noticed something truly unexplained. Off in the distance, they would spot what they later described as a cigar or boat-shaped object, which had oars running from the bottom and a picnic canopy on top, which seemed to be hovering in the air. The weird craft would come to settle down on the field below, and I'm guessing it was far enough away from these men that they couldn't make it there in time to see exactly what it was, because about 15 minutes later, it ascended back up into the air and flew off in a northerly direction. It would be about 3.5 hours after this, in an area called Green Ridge, that it was spotted again. Curiously, Green Ridge is only a 5-minute or so drive away, so it makes you wonder what this craft was doing in the meantime. Well, it could be that it was still having some kind of mechanical problem, because it was this sighting where a man allegedly stepped forth from the aircraft itself and began working on it for about 10 minutes, where it seemed to have fixed the issues and the craft headed back on its way. Next, around 8 p.m., about 2 hours later, it would be seen in Sherman, about 40 miles away, and then on to Williamsville, even further north, about 8:45 p.m. Curiously, by 9 p.m., reports about a similar craft were made in St. Louis, over 100 miles away, suggesting there were 2 crafts, or this thing was really quick, which might actually be the case, because the following night around 8:30 p.m., more than 100 residents of Whitehall, north of St. Louis, reportedly seen the craft flying at a great speed, around 150 miles an hour, but these were the most recent sightings. Since word traveled slow in those days, it wasn't until later that residents realized this had been going on for a short time. Even as early as April the 10th, 3 days before it was spotted in Millwood, it had actually been seen in Jacksonville. No, not Jacksonville, Florida, the one in Illinois. This time, it would even be seen by local authorities, including police officers and firemen. The following night, the foreman of the Sangamon County Jail in Springfield watched the craft fly over with a, quote, radiating light, not unlike a locomotive headlight. He said all in all, he was able to observe it for about 30 minutes. The sighting would actually be heavily debated, with many of the city's leading scholars suggesting that everyone was really just seeing a star that was brighter than usual, and they blew the whole thing off. There would be a few more sightings within the coming days before the whole thing was quickly forgotten, with the last coming from Hillsboro, where it was said to have been observed in the western sky by a number of the more respectable citizens. Now, what's different about the central Illinois sightings is, instead of going along and exaggerating the narrative, the media here was largely skeptical. Of course, I already pointed out that many of them believed it was a bright star, or maybe a planet, while others suggested a more prankster-type theory, such as a group of people around town that were sending up balloons shaped like ships, which they simply attached lights to, all in an effort to hoax the town and get a little bit of attention. But maybe the simplest explanation is folklore. In fact, that sighting in Springfield by the jailer wasn't the only one. There was another story that 2 men were about 3 miles west of the city and they seen a large light in the sky land about 200 feet away from them. At first, they were scared, until a long-bearded man approached them and said his airship had made it there from Quincy in about 30 minutes, and these 2 men were invited on board to go look at the aircraft, where this mad scientist's wife was also at. They noted that its frame was made of aluminum and covered with canvas and carried an ordinary locomotive headlight. What's interesting is that this exact same story happened in Hot Springs, Arkansas. We actually covered it back in the Southern series, meaning that this story was written and copied by several journalists and spread throughout the country, or there were several mad scientists around the country tinkering with these aircrafts. May 11th, 1987, Grand Forks, North Dakota. 18-year-old Carrie Simmers had just finished babysitting and was on her way back home to the apartment that she shared with her aunt, Anna Korynta, as she had just moved in with her from Minnesota a few months prior. The girls were very close, and they were more like sisters, which no doubt had to do with their age, because although Anna was technically her aunt, she was only 1 year older than her 18-year-old niece. The two both worked and went to school, sharing the rent of the little apartment, but tonight, that would all change. As Carrie arrived and unlocked the door, she would walk in and immediately notice something odd, because the two girls prior to this set up night lights throughout the home, since they didn't want to walk into a dark apartment. Yet strangely, all of the night lights had been unplugged. Carrie would begin feeling around in the dark and called out for Anna. She would make it through the living room and kitchen and then went to her room to check on her. But as soon as she took a step in, she almost tripped. She looked down to see Anna's lifeless body. She had apparently been trying to get to the telephone, but the blood splattered everywhere told Carrie she didn't make it, and yet succumbed to her wounds at the foot of the bed. After screaming, Carrie would quickly grab the phone and tried to dial 911, but because of the shock, forgot the number. She tried dialing an operator, which did not work. She eventually called her boyfriend and fled the home, not knowing if maybe the killer was still around. Her boyfriend would show up, her now husband, and checked Anna's pulse before calling authorities, and it was too late. But detectives did arrive shortly and scoped out the scene. And this is where things immediately looked discouraging, because there was nothing to work with. I mean, there was the obvious. She had been stabbed in the torso area and had defensive wounds on her hands, along with being stabbed in the back. The weapon was not there, although it was believed to have been a particularly long knife blade, but that was pretty much all detectives had. For one, there was no sign of a struggle, and no signs of forced entry. Likewise, no witnesses, nor has she been sexually violated. And this only got more baffling as detectives began to dig into her life, because they couldn't find any enemies. At first, they actually turned their focus on one of the least expected suspects, her niece, 17-year-old Carrie. They would even do the traditional police tactic of putting her in a room under a bright light while one investigator yelled at her. They basically claimed it was a dark love triangle involving them and some guy. The fact that they even took this route made Anna's whole family even more discouraged, because they knew the police had no idea where to start. They had zero leads, and they were just shooting in the dark. They soon turned away from her, though, for multiple reasons. The big one being, she had an alibi. She had actually worked all day, and while at her job, she got a phone call asking her to babysit that night. That's when Carrie would call Anna multiple times to let her know she wouldn't be home until around midnight, although Anna never answered these calls. Anna's timeline was eventually narrowed down, and investigators knew she had left her job sometime that evening too, and then stopped to get a bite to eat and made it home about 6:30, with the murder taking place about an hour later. Although the investigators didn't have much in the way of real clues, they were able to deduce one thing really quick, that this was not a stranger. It had to be someone known, maybe known to Carrie as well. Detectives would interview many family members and friends in hopes of narrowing down who that might be, but they never found a suspect. And you may think, let's look at the obvious. What about her boyfriend? Yeah, about that. Anna had been dating a young man that she was crazy in love with, and actually, just a month prior, he had proposed to her, and the two were engaged. Tragically though, her fiancé of just a few hours would die later that same day in a terrible car crash. Anna was destroyed, and unsurprisingly, was still grieving. Because of this, she had not been dating. In spite of that, investigators were sure that it had to be someone like an old boyfriend, but Anna's family was unconvinced. Which goes back to the key question, why did investigators believe it wasn't a stranger? That was the key part. As mentioned previously, there was no forced entry, but what really tipped them off was Anna was in her nightgown, suggesting she knew whoever this was quite well. Likewise, a stranger intending to do harm would have most likely busted in as soon as she opened the door and would have immediately attacked her, dragging her downstairs to the room afterwards. That is not what the evidence showed. No, she opened the door, and this person made it to her room after being invited. Which brings us to the key question. Who was it? And why was he so upset? Those would not be the only questions left unanswered. How did he leave when he would have no doubt still have been covered with blood? At a time when there was still sunlight out, there was also not one smattering of blood anywhere in the home other than the bedroom, nor were there any fingerprints left behind by him. Detectives tried hard, and even had a few persons of interest. But really, they weren't great ones, as they all had alibis. They did eventually find one man that they felt better about than the others, but he too had his issues, and they didn't have enough to arrest him. Interestingly, the FBI would get involved after the case went cold, and they would develop a profile on who they believed was responsible. They suggested a man in his 20s with a yo-yo type personality, friendly at times, but also moody. He may have went through a divorce at one time and was drinking heavily or using drugs. Now that's interesting because one of these persons of interest fit that profile to a T. The FBI would take another look at the case in the late 90s, and police tried to get an interview with the same men that it had talked to a decade before, and they all refused, leaving the case stuck. But to get back to the other question, why was this man so mad that he went into this rage and killed her? Detectives had an idea on that too. They believed this guy came over to her apartment under the guise that he was going to comfort her because she was still grieving over the loss of her fiancé. But his real intentions was getting with her. And more than likely, after the fake comforting, he made a move. One which she rejected, and he flew off the handle, which is really kind of surprising since he was also so calm enough to realize he needed to wipe up every bit of evidence before he left. Not to mention, he brought the knife with him and hid it the whole time, suggesting that he would have had to plan it somewhat. Almost 4 decades later, and the case is basically where it started. The little DNA evidence they could salvage has already been tested, while the majority of the other evidence was lost in a flood of 1997. The case is kind of obscure, not really showing up on any of the crime forums, which is why I wanted to give it some attention. Today, the leading theory is that it was someone involved in her life who had a crush on her, maybe a secret crush, and he was waiting for the chance to move in. And when she rejected him, he couldn't handle it. He was probably known to some of her friends and family, but not known well. He may have even been someone she was working with at the grocery store, or perhaps a customer, maybe even someone living in or providing maintenance at the apartment where she lived. July 4th, 1974, Oakland, a small town in Nebraska, would play home to one of the more curious cryptid sagas of the 70s. It all began in the late night/early morning hours when couple Dale and Linda Jones were awoken to a horrendous sound. Outside, they heard an animal scream, and at first, the farmers thought that one of the pigs had gotten its head stuck in the pen, which had happened before. Dale got up and began heading outside to remove the poor animal so they could get some sleep. While he was getting ready, he heard his German Shepherd begin barking from the porch, which had no doubt been awoken by the same screaming pig. Dale, with flashlight in hand, started walking across the farm in the direction of the pig pen and shined the light over, looking for the critter. He stood there for a second looking around, and curiously, no pigs were stuck. He assumed by the time he had made it out there, it had maneuvered in such a way that it had dislodged itself. So Dale, who I'm sure was aggravated at this point, began walking back inside. But it was just then he heard the piercing scream again. This time, it sent a shiver up his spine, and he panicked and took off in a run towards the house. And upon getting inside, he went to look for a bat, as he intended to take it around the farm to check on the rest of the livestock. While he was doing that, his wife Linda went out on the porch to try and quieten their dog. And this is where the mystery began, because Linda would look out into the front yard, and several hundred feet away, she would see a silhouette of a figure, one that spooked her. As she stared, the thing turned and took off running on 2 legs between the corn cribs and on through the cornfield. She stepped back inside and locked the doors and windows, not sure if she had just seen a prowler or what. But she warned Dale to not go back out, and he didn't. Instead, they waited the night out, checking every now and again, but never seeing the unidentified figure. This was the first sighting of the cryptid, known as Oakland creature, but it sure wouldn't be the last, as it would be seen all over this small little town in the summer of 1974. It would actually be a few days later when 13-year-old Nick Wickstrom and his brother were delivering newspapers while being escorted by their father. when they would all three see something large running alongside a gravel road. It ran strangely, like it was using its front knuckles to move about. It had no tail, and its legs looked human. The three had all grown up in the country and had spent many days outdoors, but had never seen a local animal like this. And that's another key part of this story here. The descriptions varied among witnesses. Some said it stood about 6 feet tall, with a bear's body and a monkey's face. Others stated it looked like a big mountain lion, while even others described it as looking like a giant possum. The sightings continued, with some local teenagers spotting it at a tree line along the cemetery. They would throw some firecrackers, which spooked the animal, causing it to flee into the woods. After this, the town authorities actually got involved. They didn't necessarily believe it was a Bigfoot, but they did believe people were seeing something. And they may have feared it was a starving cougar or coyote, which was on the prowl looking for an easy human prey. So the police, in response, took a coyote-trained tracking dog and began searching the area. But even after spending hours and hours searching, they couldn't find any tracks, made almost impossible due to a drought that year. And if you want a little extra WTF mystery on this part, the police chief leading this was Greg Webb, who killed his neighbor/former girlfriend and fled to Florida, only to be arrested 7 years later after he was recognized on Unsolved Mysteries. Yeah, that's the same guy who was looking for the Oakland creature. Anyways, going back to the first couple that spotted the animal, Dale and Linda Jones, they began to suspect that whatever it was living on their farm and used it as a base of operations of sort. They based this on the fact that they would continue to hear its screams almost every night, but they were never able to locate it. Because of this, the town soon organized a hunting party, and now the media was interested, and they would send cameras out to document the bizarre hunt, though it always came up empty-handed. Interestingly, at the same time this was going on, the infamous reports of cattle mutilations began to come in across the country, which included northeastern Nebraska. So, since they had their accounts, was it related to this animal? Officials at the time did not believe so, pointing out the very precise nature of the mutilations. Regardless, cold weather began to move in by September, and soon the animal screams and sightings all stopped. Because of this, local law enforcement would state that the whole event was probably caused by a cougar who had came closer to town because the drought brought him in along a creek looking for food. And it makes sense. Although it is rare for cougars to go east of the Rockies, it may have, and being spotted late at night or deep in the woods would make their proportions look weird, making them look bigger. But it may have been something like a large feral dog as well. Others suggest an exotic pet which had been released or escaped, maybe some kind of primate. But it's just as likely that once the story circulated about the Joneses sighting, it caused some sort of mass hysteria where everyone in this small town thought any strange sound like coyote howls or the rustling of corn had to be the Oakland creature. When it comes to American explorers, there are no names bigger than Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, or better known as Lewis and Clark. They were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson in 1804 to explore what was then called the Louisiana Purchase, what is basically the main interior of what is now the United States. When the US bought the land from France, very little was known about it, other than they knew it would have to be explored before Western expansion. So it's of little surprise that there would be the need for some kind of expedition just to get a feel of things and make some maps and records of things they seen along with Native Americans they met. The goal was simple. Starting in Missouri, they needed to reach the Northwest Pacific. The two men that were selected were perfect for the job, and along their journey, which was helped by Sacagawea, the men made great discoveries, including 178 plants that had never been documented before, plus 122 animals, all completely new to Western science. Maybe the most famous of these was the grizzly bear, but it's one discovery they made that doesn't get a lot of recognition. That is the center of our mystery. It comes from the journal that Meriwether Lewis had kept along the entire expedition, which detailed practically everything. He would note on hearing a strange noise coming from just north of due west. that was loud and sounded exactly like a 6-pound cannon firing about 3 miles away from them. His men would mention it to him, since he was kind of ignoring it, thinking it was the sound of thunder in the distance. But a few days later, as they were walking out over the open plains, he would hear the sound of the cannon again, which was bizarre because there was not one single cloud or breeze, but it was unmistakable. Someone was firing a cannon in the area. What makes that peculiar was there were no Europeans in this area at the time. The French had never actually colonized this far north, and instead had just made claims to the land, which they then sold to the US, while the Spanish was concentrated in the southwest around California. The British, too, had no fortifications or men here, so that left the question, who the heck was firing this cannon? Well, Lewis had no idea, but he would note, if he had time, he could probably figure out where it was coming from. Alas, he did not have time. After this, there would be 2 more accounts by Lewis where he recorded the artillery of the Rocky Mountains. He would also talk about meeting the Pawnee and Arikara Indians on the Missouri River who had told him about this same mysterious noise, which seemed to come from the Black Hills in South Dakota. He had ignored them, thinking it was a rumor or a silly superstition. But it wasn't just the Native Americans that would tell him about this. One of the most famous traders from that time period, the French-Canadian Jean Vallee, who had hosted the men in his home on the Cheyenne River the previous year, told them that in the Black Hills they would hear a great noise frequently. But it wasn't just Lewis that documented it. Clark would weigh in too. He would note, it's possible that the large river upstream from the Great Falls, running towards where the sound seems to come from, was named Medicine River, now Sun River, because of this mysterious rumbling. Among the Missouri River tribes, anything unexplainable is often called medicine. This was only the start of a weird phenomena that would startle the earliest settlers crossing the vast western plains. One of these was Oregon County explorer Wilson Price Hunt, hearing the noise on his way to the mouth of the Columbia River. Again, it came from the area of the Black Hills. Even close to 7 decades later, in 1872, the phenomenon was still occurring, because when a Northern Pacific Railroad sent a man named Thomas Roberts to Montana to conduct a survey, he would write in his journal about hearing the same sounds that Lewis and Clark had heard all those years ago. And again, he noted that it was a strange coincidence that it was coming from around the Great Falls of Missouri. So what exactly were Lewis and Clark hearing? Just a year after their expedition ended, many of the day's scholars would come forward to offer up their explanations. And maybe, unsurprisingly, the first suggestion was none other than avalanches. One of these was a French explorer named Alexander Henry, who noted seeing snow crashing down from the slopes of mountains and watching them from a distance only to see the snow and debris hit and a loud sound of thunder echo through the valley. Today, though, the leading theory is atmospheric ducting, which is when temperature inversions in the atmosphere can refract and channel distant sounds, like thunder, mining blast, or even artillery, which then travels way further than it normally would. Another theory is brontides, which are very low magnitude tremors, too weak to make the ground shake, but strong enough to make audible booms in the air, while some suggest pressurized pockets of methane gas, which are trapped underground and suddenly rupture, thus causing explosions. It was a misty morning on July 10th, 1967, when 25-year-old Leota Camp of Des Moines, Iowa, would wake up and begin getting things ready for her family. Her husband was set to go out early for work, so he kissed her goodbye and went on his way. After this, she would start getting breakfast ready for the 3 small children, 4-year-old Kevin, 3-year-old Brenda, and 3-month-old Christine. As the morning wore on, she would let the kids go out in the backyard to play, while she continued taking care of the baby, going out every so often to check on the kids, plus hang up laundry on the clothesline. One would not think anything other than this was a typical day for the mother of 3. But that state of calmness would be upset soon, because sometime after noon, the next door neighbor of the Camp family, a woman named Mrs. Grow, would hear the crying of the small children at her door. She would go to open it and see 4-year-old Kevin exclaim, "Mommy's bleeding." Mrs. Grow knew something bad had happened, but probably couldn't have been prepared for what she would find. Running into and through the house, she found Leota on the bed in a pool of her own blood. Mrs. Grow was shocked and ran back outside and called for another neighbor who just happened to be out in her yard, a Mrs. Edwards, and the two went back in together and this time looked closer. They could see Leota was face down, with her arms crossed and tied behind her back with a necktie. She also had ties on her neck and ankles, with one final one stuffed into her mouth like a gag. Curiously, she had been left clothed. On the bed beside her was a 6-inch kitchen knife which had been used to stab her. After the gag was removed, Leota moaned, but she could not answer questions or converse. The authorities were called and made it pretty quick, and began performing artificial respiration, but it was too late, and Leota would die on her way to the hospital. Soon, her husband Raymond was called and told to meet at the emergency room where he received the terrible news. It was a horrible scene, and one that left a lot of questions. Leota had been tied up and then stabbed in the back 4 times, with wounds that penetrated her lungs. The main questions were obvious. Why did someone attack her so viciously? How did it happen? And more importantly, who did it? The obvious motive your mind might jump to at first is something of a sexual nature. But interestingly, the medical examiner who looked over the body would conclude she had not been violated in any sexual way whatsoever. Now what makes this even stranger is nothing was stolen, nor had Leota had any known enemies, and furthermore, no one had seen this guy prior to this. And yes, there were neighbors that actually got a good look at him, which we'll come back to. As far as the how, detectives had a good idea. They believed she had stepped outside the home to check on her kids and hang up laundry on the clothesline, which probably went quicker than expected, and she would walk back in to see this man, which startled him and caused him to threaten her baby if she screamed or struggled. Detectives came up with this for the sole fact that there had been no sign of a physical struggle, and no marks, bruises, or scratches on Leota, suggesting that she had complied 100%. Yet, that doesn't explain why he entered to begin with. The knives were curious too. There were 2 different ones, both coming from the same set. One of the knives was missing the handle though, and if you're wondering why the knife was still laid beside Leota, well, that's because poor 4-year-old Kevin extracted it from her before going to get help. Investigators never got far on the motive, although the medical examiner would eventually state that it was his belief that it was a, quote, kook or pervert who got scared and panicked, although police never confirmed that. They did find out, however, that 2 weeks prior to this, someone had called the camp residence when Raymond was at work, and Leota answered, and a man asked, "Where you been?" At first, she thought it was a friend who put someone up to pranking her, so she went along with it and just replied that she was feeding the baby, and this unidentified man would state, "I thought maybe you were," and he uttered something obscene which the police never disclosed. And I'm guessing, with the technology at the time, it wasn't good enough to go back and see who actually called. But what's important was the camps had an unlisted number, so how did this guy get it? Or did he dial it randomly? Police weren't sure, and they had no idea if it was even related. As far as the who, that's where it gets tricky. In this small suburban neighborhood, someone showing up in this area, who is not usually there, is going to get some attention. And the guy did. Actually, multiple neighbors would tell police that they seen a young, white, handsome man who would pull up in a black Mustang and park about a house and a half away about 11 a.m., 1 hour before her body was found. He would step out, and residents reported that he had a good tan and was between 20 and 25, 5'8" and 5'10", with brown curly hair, and he was stocky, and wore a brown and white plaid shirt with dark trousers. As soon as he got out, he cut diagonally across the front yard and walked straight into the home. A few minutes before noon, he walked back out and was never seen again. Police would take all the descriptions from various witnesses and soon got this sketch made. Now, I don't know if it was just faded from being put in the newspaper and that's all we have left today, or if maybe the artist or description wasn't good enough to create a lower half of his face. But as you can see, the sketch wasn't much to go on. But in spite of that, the police actually got 500 tips about this guy within the first 4 days alone. How many of them actually seen him, and how many of them thought they did, no one can answer. But I'm going to guess that quite a few people really did see this individual, which makes it all the stranger that he was never identified. Even when Leota's daughter, Brenda, got older and requested the case file in 2015, she didn't find much. It was like the case had went cold from the beginning. However, once Brenda began looking into it, she did get one surprising tip. A man would call her and stated that he had studied serial killer Mike DeBarbalebin for years, and he believed he was the one responsible. And it kinda fits. The partial sketch we got was similar, and he was a sadist, and his type was brunettes. He was also active all over the country and often drove flashy vehicles like the Mustang this man was seen in. But there's no hard evidence that he was even in Iowa at that time. There's also another theory bandied about sometimes, which is not very popular, that it was all the case of mistaken identity, and the real target was a woman living in the neighborhood next to Leota. After this many decades, we will probably never get an answer. October 29th, 1969, Robert Lepsey would leave his home in Grayling, Michigan to go to his work shift at a local supermarket. It's there the 33-year-old manager and father of 4 would go about his day until his lunch shift around 1:30 p.m. That's when he would go use the store's phone and call his wife and notify her that he intended to go for a short ride on lunch to clear his head. Little could his wife know that would be the last time she would ever talk to him, as he did not come home that evening. Actually, he didn't even go back to the store to finish his shift. Instead, he would call them back a couple of hours later, telling them he was in Traverse City, about an hour's drive away, and he was taking the rest of the day off. This story is pretty old, and thus, there's not a lot of data on it, but I'm going to guess that it was his wife who reported him missing later that night. I'm unsure when the search started, but considering this was the 60s, the whole wait 24-hour rule was probably in place. Regardless, it would only take them 3 days to get their first lead on Robert, because of course after speaking to employees at the grocery store, they found out that he had called from Traverse City, so they focused their search there, and it's at a very peculiar place they would find his car. It had been abandoned at the Traverse City Capitol Airport. The doors were unlocked and the keys were left in the ignition, while half a pack of cigarettes were on the dashboard. It was strange to say the least, because first of all, he had taken no personal belongings with him, and second of all, he had given no indication to anyone that he was unhappy and wanted to leave his life behind. But that's certainly what it appeared like. Actually, as the police dove into Richard's disappearance, they come up with the conclusion that he left on his own accord, and after that, they quit looking for him. Now again, the original records from this case are pretty scarce, and some of it's contradicting, so it's hard to get a straight story. But some sources claim that the family was able to have him declared legally dead in 1976, after waiting the legally required 7 years, which makes it seem like maybe the investigators weren't all that sure that he left voluntarily. Other records note that they reopened his missing persons case in 2011, which is going to be key for this mystery. But before we dive into that, I just have to note, there are other sources which state the reason that the police believed he left voluntarily is because he was thought to have embezzled about $2,000 from the grocery store, or about $17,500 in today's money. And allegedly, he was close to being caught, which is why he left the store in a hurry and fled. Police believed he eventually ended up in Mexico, which they based that on one airport employee who stated that a man resembling Lepsey had bought a ticket for Mexico before boarding the flight. However, it needs to be pointed out that he was just suspected of it and never actually charged or arrested for anything, so it's hard to really discern what happened. But that's not really the important part of our mystery. Let's go back to why this one stands out, because really so far, it doesn't look that crazy. It just looks like a man abandoning his family and responsibilities. But it's after this missing persons case was reopened in 2011 that a new crazy theory emerged. What if Robert Lepsey was D.B. Cooper? This is one that has picked up movement in recent years, and I gotta say, the sketch and his photo are strikingly similar, and the D.B. Cooper hijacking would take place just 2 years after Lepsey escaped into a new life. But what did he do in those 2 years? That is unknown, but if he really did embezzle $2,000 and was on the run, it's safe to say he would have kept a low profile and may have even gotten a new identity. Now, there are weaknesses in this theory, obviously, like he had no background in skydiving, aviation, or even military training, which is what most investigators believe that D.B. Cooper had. Likewise, Lepsey had no known connections to the Pacific Northwest, although it's important to point out that there's no reason he couldn't have made it to the Pacific Northwest in that 2-year period. And as far as the training that he would have needed goes, well, you can point to another skyjacker, Martin McNally, who hijacked a plane in June 1972 and was given $500,000 in cash along with 4 parachutes, and he jumped out of the plane over central Indiana and survived. And the crazy part? He had no training whatsoever, meaning Lepsey could have done the same. Or he could have got some training in that 2 years he was gone. There's other data that backs it too. For one, since he was missing at the time of the hijacking, if he died during the jump, like so many people believe D.B. Cooper did, well, that explains why no family members reported him missing, because Lepsey was already reported missing. In fact, it would be his family that eventually notified the FBI that Lepsey resembled the sketch and actually had the same suit that Cooper had been described by witnesses as wearing, along with his loafers. He also had a Midwestern origin without a discernible accent, which matched the FBI profile. However, doubters to the claim point to the fact that Cooper was said to have been in his mid-40s, where Lepsey was 33. But I'll leave it to you. Could Robert Lepsey have been D.B. Cooper? Or did he just go start a new life in Mexico? Let me know in the comment section below. 1953. Inman, Kansas. 2 young Mennonites, Albert Neufeld and George Regier Jr., hoped to get away for a day of fishing. And they had many options, because during the early 20th century in Kansas, many lakes were drained in the state, leaving small pools of water that the locals would still go use, and they often called these sinkholes. And it's at this locally named Big Sinkhole that this legendary cryptid story would be born. After sitting on the bridge for hours, the 2 young men that were fishing finally called it a day. They began reeling in their lines and putting away their gear in their tackle boxes, about to say goodbye to the water. But it's in that process that Albert would spot something out of the corner of his eye. He at first thought it was a log, but once he noticed it was moving, he thought it was a snake. But this was much different than any snake he had seen. He would point it out to George, who turned around right in time to see this creature break the water, with its dark, flat head and very large snake-like body. As it swam across the top of the sinkhole, they were able to estimate its size at about 15 feet long and 21 inches thick, or sometimes stated to be thick as a tire, with a dolphin-like tail and a broad, eerie smile which was full of teeth. Its skin was described as smooth and dark brown or black. This was unlike any snake native to Kansas, maybe to the whole country. Albert began to panic. Since this thing kept swimming around, it was not attempting to submerge, so he quickly grabbed his .22 rifle and took a couple of shots. He was certain he had hit it, but it kept swimming around, and now it was coming towards them. That's when the boys grabbed everything they had brought and took off running, going home to tell their parents, who in turn told authorities about the large creature down at the sinkhole. This would become the most famous sighting of the cryptid known as Sinkhole Sam. But it was not the first, as the boys soon learned. Apparently this thing had been spotted before, well, allegedly, It's always suspicious how all these other sightings get reported after the fact. Regardless, this account actually took hold, and the media went to cover it. They would visit the sinkhole many times, along with numerous other people from around the area. Actually, there were even people from out of state that came just to look for it. Which seems odd because it's just an oversized snake, right? Well, if the boy's description is accurate, that would rule out snake, of course. But other reports that came later on would actually state that it was more worm-like in nature. There were other variations as well, like some reports which claimed it had a long fin running down its back, while yet others said the creature was much bigger, like 30 feet long instead of 15. Maybe the second most famous account came from a group of farmers who claimed to have seen the beast sunning on the bank, and at first, they didn't know what it was, but as they got closer, it scurried off into the water and submerged, where it was rumored to live in a cavern system underneath the sinkhole. But there's not one known to be there. And that's a problem with this story. After the original account, all these other reported sightings were more dubious, and probably were just added to keep the story going. In fact, one of the local journalists that covered it greatly embellished the story just because he was kind of a folklorist and entertainer, more than a journalist. So I think it's safe to say everything outside of what Albert Neufeld and George Rogier seen can be ignored. So the question is, could you take them for their word? And if so, what did they see? Well, for what it's worth, the Neufeld family later stated they were greatly embarrassed by the whole account, and they just wished the publicity would go away. Although, Albert never shied away from telling the story to anyone who might want to hear it, while George Rogier was said to have had a, quote, town rogue reputation. But it's worth pointing out, Mennonites aren't known for exaggerations, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were telling the truth. Then, what was it? Researchers today state, more than likely, it was a gopher snake, which are native to Kansas and can get up to about 7.5 feet long. And if it was partially submerged and moving, one can mistake how large they really are because of the silhouette produced. And gopher snakes are known to swim and look like a much larger serpent gliding, and it could have just been an unusually large gopher snake at that. The second most likely theory is someone had just bought an exotic pet and couldn't or didn't want to take care of it anymore, like a boa constrictor or python. And yes, people done that in the 50s too, just not as much. If someone released one into the Kansas wilderness, he would try to take refuge in a marsh or sinkhole type environment where it could feed on rodents and other small mammals, but it wouldn't survive past the Kansas winter. But as I mentioned, I think you can practically ignore every other sighting after that one, except for the one where the farmer seen it sunning on the bank. Then, you got the minor theories, like it was an optical illusion like a log, or submerged tree, or they could have just seen an exceptionally large snapping turtle. Regardless of whatever it was, it's become one of the most famous cryptid stories coming out of Kansas. On the morning of March 29th, 1973, Ottawa, Kansas, a woman on her morning commute to work would call police to inform them that there was an abandoned sedan parked on the side of a country road. The woman, probably not thinking much of it, could never guess that she had just drove by one of the most infamous, brutal unsolved crimes in the history of Kansas. The confusing story actually began about a day and a half prior, on the night of March 27th, when a 19-year-old, Steve Avery, of Iola, Kansas, was looking for a way to get to Lawrence, about 80 miles away. He had promised his friend and Vietnam War veteran, 23-year-old Gary Longfellow, that he would go testify on his behalf in a paternity suit the following day. But Steve's wife, Diane, refused to let him take the only vehicle that they had, which prompted a fight between the two. Why she did not allow him the vehicle is unknown, but it could be because the two had a small child at home, and she didn't want to be stranded there just in case. In any event, Steve would do like a lot of people did in the 70s and chose to hitchhike to Lawrence, where I guess he intended to get a room and go speak on his friend Gary's behalf the next morning. The record isn't exactly clear on his plan. What is clear is this would not be the easy trip that he envisioned. After a night of hitching rides, he would find himself now walking about 40 miles away from his destination, when, a terrible storm blew in. Steve would do the only sensible thing and find a payphone and called his mother, 60-year-old Hazel Avery, and he asked her if she could travel to where he was, pick him up, and take him the rest of the way. Hazel, of course, would do it since the weather was so bad, but her being older and it being a very stormy night, would call Gary, Steve's friend, and ask him to ride along. Now again, as I mentioned, this story is a little bit confusing, as I'm unsure why Gary wasn't with Steve in the first place, considering he was going to speak for him on his behalf anyways. Seems like a pretty big favor to do for a friend who was just sitting at home waiting. Regardless, Gary agreed to accompany Hazel to pick up Steven and take him the rest of the way. They would leave by 10:30, and we know this because they were seen by witnesses. Not to mention, Hazel called her sister to let her know the pair were leaving. What happens next is where the mystery comes in, because although this would have been a trip which should have taken 3 hours or so, Gary's father began to worry when it got up late into the night and his son had still not returned. So he would call the police to report the 3 missing, and he would also get the family members to go out and look for them. It was also at this time that the Avery family were made aware of the situation, and they too would begin a search. But for the first day, not one clue was found, and this is when we go back to the beginning of the story, when our driver would call in and report the abandoned sedan sitting on the side of the road. That's when things got dark. Once police arrived, they found the car of the Avery family, and inside, all 3 were deceased. They were knelt down on the floorboards with their heads in the seats. Hazel in the front passenger, Steven in the rear passenger, and Gary on the rear driver's side. All 3 had contact wounds, which indicated a gun had been placed on their heads when the trigger was pulled. In total, there were 7 bullets recovered. Steve shot twice, Hazel 3 times, and Gary twice. One of his was the most curious, because it was at the bottom of his foot, so it was speculated that he had tried to run or possibly kick back up at the shooter, although there was no real way to know. Finally, detectives and the coroner came to the conclusion that all of this had happened sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. the previous day. The murders were brutal and senseless in their own, but what detectives found next was even more disturbing, or maybe I should say, what they didn't find. That's right, a motive. To this day, there's never been one uncovered. First of all, investigators could find nothing that had been stolen. All of the valuables were left in the car and on the victims. This includes jewelry. And on top of that, there were no signs that anyone had been sexually violated. But what about any enemies? Well, there were a couple of problems with this theory. First of all, police could not find anything sketchy about Gary or Steve, or heck, even Hazel for that matter. Neither of the young men had a criminal record, and by all accounts, they seemed like good young men. Police did, however, found that Steve had 1 or 2 people that didn't like him much, but there wasn't anything that indicated those people were involved, nor had they planned it. Speaking of planning, that was another major problem with this theory. Detectives deemed it very unlikely that any of this could have been planned, for a couple of reasons. For one, no one other than Hazel's sister and Gary's father knew that the 2 were even driving back to pick up Steve, because he had intended to hitchhike all the way there, and he had only changed his plan once the heavy rains came in. So for someone to have been waiting on all 3 is a non-go from the start. There were also no other tire tracks in the area, so the car wasn't ran off the road by anyone, although a county road grader had came through the area before the car was found, and it's possible tire tracks were covered. But it was also possible that this other person was just invited inside the vehicle or somehow commandeered it. But why? Again, that's the issue with this one. Police had no idea, but they were convinced of one thing. They believed this was a professional hit, orchestrated by someone. Whoever done it had pulled off similar crimes before, although they admitted it still leaves the issue of how they captured their target that night, whomever it was, because Gary and Hazel were not even supposed to be out there, and Steve should have been hitchhiking and potentially riding with random drivers. None of this made sense. But you're probably wondering, what about the paternity suit that Steve was going to testify at? Could that woman have been involved? Police thought that immediately, but after a brief interrogation, they realized she had nothing to do with it. In fact, Even though Steve could not testify in the defense of Gary, Gary still won the paternity suit, which basically stated he was not the father. Although the professional hit theory was seriously considered, they did look at a random killer theory, like maybe they had picked up a hitchhiker of their own. Detectives even considered Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, but again, there were two ruled out. Rumors helped fill in the blanks, with some people claiming that it was over an unpaid gambling debt, another tip the police could not find any evidence on. Now, making this case even more convoluted would come over 3 weeks later, when on April 18th, the badly decomposed body of a young man with a bashed-in skull was found in a drainage ditch around 30 minutes north of the abandoned car. An autopsy revealed his time of death was about 3 weeks prior, meaning he died very close to the same time that the Averys and Gary were killed. Was it related? Police were not sure, and they couldn't even identify the victim. Actually, it would take over 50 years when in April of 2025, the remains were finally identified as 16-year-old Jimmy Dollison, who had been reported missing by his family in late 1972. Was he an accomplice, or a witness that knew too much and was killed? Or was he just randomly targeted by the same killer? Or was it totally unrelated? That's still being looked at today. If it was a random hitchhiker, it's thought that the other three seen him walking through the storm and felt bad for the person, since Steve had just went through the same thing a few minutes ago. So they pulled over and gave him a ride, and then this person got violent for some reason, pulled the gun on them, kept everyone under control until he drove them to this isolated location and seemingly murdered them for the thrill of it. The American Southwest is littered with ghost towns, former bustling communities usually set up around a resource, such as an ore, which is mined to exhaustion, leaving the townsfolk to just up and abandon them. Many of these today are tourist sites, while others have simply been forgotten, but a few of them have been completely lost. That's where our mystery begins today, and it involves a strange town that may or may not ever existed. Our story begins in 1893 and revolves around the Oklahoma land run granted by the government that year. And if you're not familiar with that term, it was basically an event in which land restricted from settlement was opened up to potential homesteaders, and they were all sold on a first-come, first-served basis. This was the fourth largest land run in U.S. history and was a 60-mile wide piece of land south of the Oklahoma-Kansas border, known as the Cherokee Outlet, since this was the land that the U.S. government had promised to the Cherokee after forcing them there. It's here our mystery lies, because on that same year of this land run, a reporter from Kansas, who remained anonymous, would pen a curious article about one of these communities which had sprang up in northern Oklahoma. And what may be a shock to some, many of these people vying for this land were women, about 20% actually. In fact, the first our brave anonymous reporter from Kansas would stumble up on would be a community known as Bathsheba, or Bathsheba. According to him, this town was made up of nothing but women. That's right, the sole 33 citizens were female, and they were there because of their overwhelming desire to be away from men, for a varying of reasons I imagine. In fact, men weren't even allowed to visit the town, and none of the citizens would speak to this reporter who had to keep his distance. He only learned about it from a farmer who lived several miles away. As mentioned, the town was made up of 33 women, although 12 of these would leave after the first week, and another was kicked out for bringing a razor, which the leader of the community deemed a masculine product, an idea that could subvert the whole town. And this leader apparently was motivated in part due to finding out her husband had a whole other family in another state, which he was able to visit since he was a traveling salesman. This might be why that even the farm animals had to be female, as the article would even note that a stray rooster was sacrificed when it wandered onto the land. The journalist covering this knew he had a splendid story, that if he could just somehow get one of the women to talk to him, or perhaps infiltrate the community, he would have a story that might go nationwide and make him famous. There was one problem. The town was guarded by a female police chief that had already fired at him once when he got too close, but it was too irresistible not to try again. So he would make the journey back the following week, hoping to get an interview. When he arrived, though, he was stunned to see that the settlement was gone. All there was an empty prairie. He eventually would go on to interview a man living nearby in a sod house, and he told him that the women had spoke to his wife before they had left and said they were lonely, afraid, and there were some major disagreements about how the town should be run and the future of the community. He stated he got up the next morning and noticed the entire area had been abandoned. And that's the mystery. Where was this town, and did it really exist? Well, there are a few issues with the story. The original article was printed in 1893, and, as you know, in that era, yellow journalism was all over the place. And the fact that the Kansas reporter wanted to remain anonymous gives some doubt to the claim. Actually, the story didn't get modern-day recognition until it was uncovered by another reporter, Robert E. Cunningham of the Daily Oklahoman, in 1961, who had researched the archives. This brought focus back onto this unique story, and another journalist would begin his research on it, and he eventually found a woman who claimed to have actually visited the community almost 70 years prior. She claimed the original idea spawned after one woman got her claim, which gave her 160 acres, and she decided she wanted to do a woman-only area, and the story spread like wildfire, causing many women to want to join her. But that was also the cause of its downfall, because instead of a united front of women arriving at the same time with the same goal, you had women showing up randomly at different times, and there was just no real cooperation. However, it's worth pointing out that this elderly woman the journalist found wished to remain anonymous, so her claims are unverifiable. Likewise, many have pointed out that there is just not one artifact found anywhere that actually shows this community once existed. Plus, they've only found that one article from the 1890s that documents this, and on top of that, the women wouldn't just show up and abandon it. It was worth too much money, and someone, maybe that first woman, would have sold it. That should be documented somewhere. And then there's the obvious town name, Bathsheba, a woman in the Bible known for her scandal. Could it be this came from a journalist who, as many men felt at the time, feared women having total independence? However, if it was real, it could be the reason that it was never found is because it was really just a transient camp. During the chaos of the 1893 land run, groups of single women would camp together briefly for mutual protection, and it's possible this reporter stumbled up onto an assortment of tents of nothing but women who threatened to shoot him if he got close, only for that community to be gone just a few days later, which would explain everything. What we do know is the settlement was said to be somewhere between the towns of Perry and Enid, which sat about 45 miles apart. It was the 4th of July weekend in 2019 when 25-year-old Chance Englebert of Wyoming made plans with his wife to take their 3-month-old child a little over 200 miles away in Gehring, Nebraska, to visit Chance's in-laws. The visit was a much-needed mental break for the young family, as Chance had recently just lost his job, but luckily, he had found a new one that he would be starting the following week. While there, they intended to stay with his wife's grandparents, and on the 6th, a Saturday, he would go golfing with his father-in-law, along with his sister-in-law's boyfriend. After some time on the course, he would call and check in with his wife, Bailey, and told her the three were having a good time and had been drinking, and they would be back in a bit. However, this would all change not long after, because Chance would call his wife back again, and this time, he asked her to come pick him up. Apparently, there was a comment made to him about his new job, which he didn't appreciate. What this comment was, and who exactly said it, his father-in-law or his sister-in-law's boyfriend, is unknown. But Chance was pretty upset and just wanted to leave, so his wife went towards the golf course and picked him up. Here's where things would get a little bit chaotic. Chance, by this point, just wanted to wrap the weekend up early. He was aggravated and just wanted to go back home to Torrington, Wyoming, and relax until his new job started on Monday. Bailey, however, refused, and this started an argument between them. she would end up taking him back to her grandparents' home. As soon as they pulled up, Chance got out of the vehicle and started walking away. Bailey at this time thought nothing of it, because she stated she thought he was just walking to cool off, something he did when he would get angry. But after a few minutes, she would call to check on him and see if he would come back. But he didn't answer. She called and called again before finally walking after him, but she couldn't find him. A few hours and many phone calls later, Chance would finally answer her phone calls at 7:46 p.m. and told her he was walking towards Kimball and then hung up on her. Now it's worth noting, Kimball was south and the opposite way of his home in Wyoming. It was also a 15-hour walk. This was only made more confusing by the fact that Chance had been calling his friends, whom he was asking for a ride, and told them he was walking north towards Torrington, Wyoming, about a 12 hours walk. The last friend he reached out to was a man named Matt Miller, who took his call at 8:46 p.m., and this would be the last official time that we know someone spoke to him. His aunt, however, would receive a strange text from him just 20 minutes later. The text read, "I'm," which was followed by a neutral face emoticon, and then a word spelled IBDESEREALLYG. His aunt was confused, like anyone would be, and she replied, "You are what?" But Chance never replied. Meanwhile, his wife and family were starting to get worried because a severe thunderstorm was rolling into the area. Bailey and her grandparents waited for the storm to blow through and drove around town looking for him. They believed he probably sought shelter in a local store or maybe an abandoned building, but they couldn't find him. The next morning, Bailey's family, along with Chance's family, started calling law enforcement, who soon launched a wide-scale search for him. They brought in helicopters, dogs, and even conducted water searches with divers. Over 2,400 acres were searched, and not one clue came up. However, while there was a physical search taking place, investigators began trying to run down exactly where it was that he had been, and they got lucky because they found out around 10 p.m. he was spotted on camera walking past a business in Terrytown, Nebraska, only about a mile and a half from Gering, where Chance had walked away from earlier. It appeared as if he was following the GPS on his phone. After this, there was no more video evidence, but tips continued to pour in. People in both Wyoming and Nebraska claimed to have seen him, with one woman in Casper, Wyoming, telling police she had an interaction with him at Walmart. When police reviewed up to 6 hours of video footage from around the time she claimed to have seen him, they could not find him on the video, and they haven't found him since. Police actually ran down several leads and tips, and performed numerous searches, executed search warrants, pretty much everything you would hope could be done, and there's just never been one clue pop up. And while they haven't found a sign of foul play either, they have been quick to point out they can't rule it out. But just because law enforcement has ran into a dead end in their investigation doesn't mean the family has given up. They would hire a private investigator who uncovered an interesting lead on his own. A store clerk said a man matching Chance's description came in and got into a tense conversation with another man in the back of the store before purchasing a drink and tobacco and exiting the store between 8:30 and 9. That store was about 2 miles away from where he would be seen on camera around 10 p.m. This also went along with the tip that came in, which stated there were 2 women in their mid-20s in an obvious state of panic trying to flag down traffic. This is important because this was around the same time and area that Chance was last seen in. The women, who seemed to be looking for help, eventually got into the truck with someone and they left the scene. This was actually called in by 2 separate witnesses. Police believe they may have seen something happen to Chance, yet these people have never been found, nor have they came forward. Today, theories are divided, but most lean towards the thought that he simply got disoriented during the storm and fell into the North Platte River nearby. If he was stressed out and tired, or distracted from following his GPS on his phone, he could have fell and drowned, and the body was just never found. Others think the man arguing with him in the store was responsible, and that the girls, who were seen panicking, witnessed what had happened and never came forward. Of course, the theory you're waiting on is his in-laws were responsible, and there is a lot of rumors that point to that. Like for instance, some reports claim it was more than an argument that he got into with his in-laws at the golf course. Some say it was a full-fledged fight. Numerous podcasts have covered the story, and they bring up many claims, like his wife Bailey asking for a death certificate almost immediately, or asking about insurance payouts. However, other sources dispute that and say it is nothing more than rumor mongering. What can't be disputed was both families did not like each other, and that ultimately could have led to Chance's demise. When it comes to UFO sightings across America, South Dakota, our next mysterious state, ranks near the bottom, coming in at number 46 in recorded sightings, with 272 reported between the years of 2021 and 1974, when the National UFO Reporting Center began tracking them. Now, most of you will know that fact has more to do with South Dakota's small population than anything else, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because when it comes to these sightings, it's not the number that matters. Instead, it's the quality. And South Dakota actually plays home to one of the most famous UFO cases in history, the Ellsworth Air Force Base incident. It all began on August 5th, 1953, around 8:05 p.m., when a woman named Mrs. Kellyan would spot something odd in the sky. She was in the Black Hills, about 10 miles away from Ellsworth, when she noticed a glowing red light emitting from above. See, Mrs. Kellyan was actually a member of the Ground Observer Corps, which is a volunteer program that worked as part of the United States Air Force Civil Defense Service, and whose task was mainly to go out to one of these 14,000 observation points and watch for any Soviet aircraft that might be flying overhead, possibly spying, or even worse, planning to attack. And it's important to point out here, these volunteers were trained by the military, specifically to watch for enemy bombers, and that will prove significant later on. After spotting the light, she would call to the local Ground Observer Corps, who in turn forwarded her call to the radar controller at Ellsworth Air Force Base. It's here she began describing what she had seen, a red light that moved some 30 degrees to the right, then shot straight up, then moved to the left back to its original position. After this, it began moving south towards Rapid City. In response to this development, the commander at the Air Force Base would dispatch 2 airmen to go up and look for it, and the pilots found the light exactly where the spotter said it would be. Not only that, but by now, back at the control tower, the radar indicated the movement as well. The officer monitoring it knew that the weather could sometimes cause the radar to give anomalies, so he studied it for a few minutes, but it remained well defined, solid, and bright as it moved slowly across the sky, displaying 2 blips. He would call out for an altitude reading, and another officer found that it was flying at a height of 16,000 feet. By this time, the pilots who were flying the F-84 jet fighter had tracked the light and stated it circled Rapid City and was now moving back to its starting position where Mrs. Kellyan had first seen it. The first pilot was giving the orders to engage it, and when he got within 3 miles of this object, it began to move, and again, this was visually confirmed by not only the pilot and Mrs. Kellyan on the ground, but also the radar operator. 4 blips verified its movement. The last blip was some 70 miles away, pulling further and further away from it, until it got around 120 miles away to the north, where the pilot began to run out of fuel and had to turn back. Interestingly, when he landed, he would tell the officers on the ground he had observed an object that was silver in color and varied in intensity. While this was going on, the second pilot was given the order to engage. This man, a World War II and Korean War vet, stated that it did feel like maybe he was just chasing a star in the sky, but there were things about it that disturbed him, that made him question if he was really seeing a star, like the fact that it appeared to jump in elevation, or like when it appeared to parallel his course. The pilot checked in the cockpit for anything that might be giving off a reflection, creating an illusion that he was seeing, but there was nothing, which was odd because he said this thing was considerably brighter than a star and could change intensity and color from green to white. As he climbed higher and higher in pursuit, the object climbed as well. At around 26,000 feet, the radar again picked up the plane and object. The pilot, to his credit, began doing a number of tests to rule out common causes for so-called flying saucers, like he turned off his instrument lights and kicked the plane around to make sure he was not chasing a canopy reflection. He then started paying attention to the stars, and it's here he seen the object move across them, ruling out that he was chasing a planet or a star. Finally, he turned the radar gun sights on. This was important because this type of jet had a light on the instrument panel that indicated a lock-on when the target moved into the radar sights. And when this red object moved into frame, the light on the instrument panel came on. Although, it has to be noted, the pilot later on stated that the radar gun lock continued to malfunction on its way back to the base, so it might have just been a glitch. Regardless, after 3 hours of tracking the object, it finally vanished for good. Last seen heading to Fargo, North Dakota, where multiple volunteer spotters on the ground reported seeing a fast-moving bright bluish-white light pass over. The whole incident would go down as one of the best recorded UFO sightings in U.S. history, with 45 civilians, many of these trained, and multiple U.S. military air defense system personnel. And because of that, it's one of the go-to cases when bringing up a real true unidentified flying object. However, there are skeptics, of course, like some who state that it can all be chalked up to radar anomalies caused by temperature inversion, which can distort radar returns. And as far as the two pilots go, they more than likely just seen stars. Or maybe there was a meteor witnessed by numerous people. In any case, it was explainable. Another theory speculated that it could have been just a secret test flight, or military aircraft, or maybe even a weather balloon. And it's possible that the officers at Ellsworth Base were not made aware of the test, or maybe they were part of the experiment. Either way, it was easily explainable. After this, you get the less believed theories, like ball lightning or mass hysteria. May 4th, 1984, in the small rural town of Westby, Wisconsin, 3 teenagers walking along a country road would make a horrifying discovery. There, off the highway, was the deceased body of an older woman, a body that hadn't been deceased very long at all. Of course, they rushed home, and the police were notified and were quickly on the scene, and an investigation began. The woman was somewhere between the ages of 50 and 63, 5'5" to 5'6", and around 150 pounds. Her hair was graying and had been styled in a perm, but most disturbingly, the woman's hands had been removed, no doubt to eliminate any chance of fingerprinting her, which obviously pointed to a homicide. In fact, that was more than obvious, as the woman's face was unrecognizable due to the extensive blunt force trauma. She had a broken jaw and eye socket, as well as having sharp force trauma to the left side of the head near her ear. Police began looking for an ID and couldn't find anything on her, but because of some other things they found, they could have never believed this woman would go on to be unidentified for over 40 years. For example, the 4-inch abdominal surgical scar that she had, or the upper dentures that she wore, which had been found broken at the scene. These dentures, which had 2 teeth missing, had specific numbers inscribed, which detectives believed to be serial numbers, but not serial numbers which linked the teeth to one specific person, although they couldn't track them to a dentist either, which really would have helped. The perp had also taken the time to remove the brand labels from all of her clothing, although her clothes did have distinctive buttons that had unique stitching. Near the scene also lay a man's watch, which ultimately led to nothing either. With no new leads and really nowhere to go, police went to the media in hopes of getting the story noticed, and perhaps someone could come forward with any kind of information. And they got a hit, because not long after this showed up on the news, a couple called into the police to report something suspicious which they had observed. While driving along this desolate road around 9:45 p.m. the same night the body was discovered, they seen a 1982 yellow Datsun on the side of the road near where the body was found. Walking around the outside of the car was a man. When he seen the people coming, he quickly rushed back to the driver's seat and drove off. Once the witnesses gave the police the exact location, they went out to investigate, and there they found tire tracks which indicated the person had made a quick U-turn. Because of this, investigators believed the couple interrupted the man when he was trying to dump the body, prompting him to take her to the next location, which also led to speculation that he had killed her somewhere else. And that kind of went along with another theory that the police had. Since her body was just dumped along the side of a gravel road with no attempt to hide it, the suspect was probably panicked and just wanted to get out of there. They also believed neither of them were local. In fact, within the past few years, pollen taken from the Jane Doe's clothing has pointed to her coming from Arizona or New Mexico, most likely a city there. Why they were in Wisconsin, however, has not been speculated on. And as far as how the two knew each other, well, detectives were pretty sure this wasn't a random attack by a stranger. Instead, this was personal, and the two knew each other extremely well. Due to the extensive damage, it was suggested that the attacker lashed out in rage over something that occurred between the two. But not what you're thinking necessarily. Instead of this crime being spurned by romantic jealousy, the theory presented most often was it was a close relative or caregiver that did it out of anger, perhaps because he felt burdened he had to take care of her, or maybe it was all for financial gain. This could be why no matching local missing report was ever made, since the suspect would continue to draw benefits and avoid suspicion. It would also explain how the suspect had such easy access. Of course, maybe none of it was planned, and the person just snapped in rage, delivering a savage beating, then panicked, and everything afterwards was just trying to cover his tracks. In this theory, the suspect would be an intimate partner. In the 4 decades since her body was found, investigators have ran down over 4,000 leads, and they still have nothing. In recent years, they have made several attempts to get the case back into the media, hoping that someone could provide that one clue needed to find resolution, while DNA research began in 2023, which hopefully will ultimately lead to a name.